Welcome, Midnight Wanderer. I'm your narrator tonight, here to lead you softly into a world where fear whispers your name. Before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more haunting bedtime tales. Share in the comments where you're listening from and what hour your night began. And if you crave a specific horror story next, let me know. The engagement ring had a piece of scalp tissue still attached to the band when it arrived at my lab on September 23, 2011. The diamond was intact, but the white gold was bent at a 45-degree angle, consistent with extreme blunt force trauma. What made my hands shake wasn't the tissue sample, it was the inscription inside, "Forever isn't long enough, M." The victim had been wearing it when she died. Her fiancé had reported her missing 3 days before we found her body in Clearwater Lake, weighted down with cinder blocks and chain. He'd filed the missing person report at 9:47 a.m., exactly 12 hours after her estimated time of death. I've been a forensic pathologist for the King County Medical Examiner's Office for 19 years. I've processed over 4,000 bodies, testified in 263 trials, and helped secure convictions in some of Seattle's most brutal homicides. But the case of Rebecca Winters changed everything I thought I understood about my job, about justice, and about how easily the truth can be buried when the right people want it gone. Rebecca was 28 years old, a pediatric oncology nurse at Children's Hospital who volunteered at the animal shelter every Saturday morning. She had a laugh that her co-workers said could brighten the darkest days in the cancer ward. She rescued a 3-legged pit bull named Chance and trained him to be a therapy dog for her young patients. Her apartment walls were covered with thank you cards from families whose children she'd cared for during their final days. She'd been planning her wedding for October 15th, exactly 3 weeks after I found her on my autopsy table. Marcus Delacroix was everything you'd expect from a successful defense attorney. 42 years old, senior partner at Delacroix and Associates, with a conviction rate so low his colleagues called him the magician. He drove a Tesla Model S, owned a waterfront condo in Capitol Hill worth $2.3 million, and had connections that reached into the prosecutor's office, the police department, and the mayor's office. He'd proposed to Rebecca on Valentine's Day 2011 at the Space Needle with a ring that cost more than she made in 6 months. Her friends said she cried for 20 minutes before she could say yes. The night of September 19, 2011, started normally, according to Rebecca's phone records. She texted her sister Amanda at 7:15 p.m., "Making dinner for M, trying that new pasta recipe you sent." At 8:33 p.m., she posted an Instagram photo of a wine glass with the caption, "Perfect Tuesday evening." At 9:47 p.m., her phone's GPS stopped transmitting from Marcus's condo. It never moved again. Marcus called 911 at 9:52 a.m. on September the 20th, reporting that Rebecca had left his apartment the previous night around 10:30 p.m. after an argument about wedding plans. He said she'd seemed upset and drove away in her Honda Civic. He assumed she'd gone home to cool off. When she didn't answer her phone the next morning, he became concerned. The responding officer noted in his report that Marcus was appropriately distressed and cooperative with all questions. The search began immediately. Rebecca's car was found at 2:15 p.m. that same day in the parking lot of Discovery Park, 4 miles from Marcus's condo. Her purse was on the front seat, wallet and phone inside, keys in the ignition. No signs of struggle. Park rangers searched the trails until dark. The Coast Guard searched the water. Volunteers distributed flyers. Marcus gave a tearful interview to King 5 News, begging for her safe return. On September 22nd at 6:23 a.m., 2 kayakers found her body in Clearwater Lake, 47 miles from Seattle. She was wrapped in a blue tarp secured with yellow nylon rope, weighted with 3 cinder blocks attached by zinc-plated chain. The water temperature was 54 degrees. Decomposition was minimal. When the dive team brought her up, she was still wearing the engagement ring. I began the autopsy at 1 p.m. External examination revealed extensive bruising to the face, neck, and upper torso. Petechial hemorrhaging in both eyes. Fracture of the hyoid bone. 3 distinct contusions on the right temporal region, each approximately 2 inches in diameter, consistent with repeated blunt force trauma from a circular object. Defensive wounds on both forearms and hands, broken nails on 6 fingers. Time of death, approximately 9:45 p.m. on September 19th, based on body temperature, rigor mortis, and stomach contents. Cause of death was manual strangulation, but she'd been beaten severely before she died. The head wounds were perimortem, inflicted while her heart was still pumping. I found carpet fibers in her hair, synthetic beige nylon with a specific dye pattern. Under her fingernails, skin cells, blood, and fragments of what appeared to be expensive cotton fabric. I documented everything with photographs, measurements, and detailed notes. I sent samples to toxicology, DNA analysis, and trace evidence. I did my job exactly as I'd been trained. The DNA results came back on September 29th. The skin cells under Rebecca's fingernails matched Marcus Delacroix. The blood was his. The fabric fibers matched a Tom Ford shirt he'd purchased at Nordstrom 3 weeks earlier, receipt verified. The carpet fibers matched the material installed in his condo in 2009. Manufacturer confirmed. His Tesla's GPS showed a trip to Clearwater Lake on September 19th, departing his building's garage at 10:47 p.m. and returning at 2:33 a.m. The cinder blocks were traced to a Home Depot purchase he'd made on his credit card at 3:15 p.m. that same day. I completed my report on October 2nd. Manner of death, homicide. I listed every piece of evidence, every measurement, every finding that pointed to Marcus Delacroix as Rebecca's killer. I sent it to Detective Sarah Kozlowski, the lead investigator, with absolute confidence that justice would follow swiftly. The next morning, I received a call from the chief medical examiner, Dr. Harold Pennington. He asked me to come to his office immediately. When I arrived, he wasn't alone. District Attorney Vincent Harlow sat in one of the leather chairs along with someone I didn't recognize, a thin man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Jonathan Reeves, Marcus Delacroix's attorney. Dr. Pennington slid my report across his desk. "We need to discuss some concerns about your findings," he said, his voice careful and measured. "There are inconsistencies that need clarification before we proceed." I spent the next 45 minutes defending every conclusion in my report. Reeves questioned my measurements, my photographs, my interpretation of the injuries. He suggested the head wounds could have occurred post-mortem during transport. He implied the DNA could have been transferred innocently during their relationship. He questioned whether I'd properly documented the chain of custody for every sample. D.A. Harlow listened without expression. Finally, he spoke. "Doctor, you understand that Marcus Delacroix is one of Seattle's most prominent attorneys. These allegations will destroy his career and reputation. We need to be absolutely certain before we move forward with charges. I'm asking you to review your findings and make sure you haven't missed any alternative explanations." I said what I'd testified to in hundreds of trials. The evidence speaks for itself. Rebecca Winters was murdered by someone she knew intimately, in a location consistent with Marcus Delacroix's residence, and her body was transported in a manner that required premeditation and physical strength. The forensic evidence conclusively links him to her death. Dr. Pennington cleared his throat. "I'm assigning Dr. Richard Morrow to conduct a secondary review of your autopsy findings. Standard procedure in high-profile cases. I'm sure you understand." Dr. Richard Morrow had been with the office for 6 years. He was competent but cautious, someone who valued his position more than controversial truths. His review took 3 days. On October the 6th, his amended report suggested that the cause of death was undetermined, that the injuries could have resulted from accidental trauma, and that the DNA evidence was inconclusive due to the intimate relationship between the deceased and the subject. I demanded a meeting with Dr. Pennington. He refused to see me. I went to Detective Kozlowski. She said the case had been reassigned to Detective Frank Morrison, who was 2 years from retirement and known for closing cases quickly without making waves. I called the DA's office. My calls weren't returned. On October 11th, Marcus Delacroix held a press conference. Standing beside his attorney and his family, he announced that the medical examiner's office had cleared him of any involvement in Rebecca's tragic death. He said she'd been the love of his life, and he would dedicate himself to finding whoever had taken her from him. He established the Rebecca Winters Memorial Foundation for Pediatric Cancer Research with a $100,000 donation. The media praised his strength and generosity in the face of grief. I made copies of everything. My original autopsy report, all photographs, all lab results, all evidence logs. I kept them in a safe deposit box at a bank across town. I contacted the Seattle Times, offering them an exclusive interview about corruption in the medical examiner's office. They declined. I reached out to Public Radio. They said they'd consider it and never called back. I tried the Seattle Weekly. The reporter I spoke with seemed interested, but his editor killed the story before publication. On October 24th, I was called into Dr. Pennington's office again. This time, HR Director Patricia Walsh was present. Dr. Pennington informed me that concerns had been raised about my professional conduct, specifically regarding unauthorized communications with media outlets and insubordination regarding administrative decisions. I was placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation into my handling of multiple cases. The investigation took 4 months. During that time, I was prohibited from entering the medical examiner's office, accessing any case files, or communicating with any staff members. I hired an attorney, Elena Rodriguez, who cost me $35,000 I didn't have. She fought to get me access to my personnel records, my performance reviews, any documentation of the supposed concerns about my work. What we found was chilling. 3 complaints had been filed against me in late October and early November 2011, all anonymous, all alleging various forms of professional misconduct. One claimed I'd contaminated evidence in the Winters case. Another said I'd falsified autopsy findings in an unrelated homicide from 2009. A third accused me of sexual harassment of a junior staff member. None of these allegations had existed before I'd completed Rebecca's autopsy. All of them emerged within weeks of my report implicating Marcus Delacroix. Elena subpoenaed the personnel records of the anonymous complainants. The court denied our motion. She requested access to the original evidence from Rebecca's autopsy, including the tissue samples, DNA results, and trace evidence. She was informed that, due to a clerical error, several key pieces of evidence had been inadvertently destroyed during routine disposal procedures. The carpet fibers, the fabric fragments, the skin cells from under Rebecca's nails, all gone. Only photographs remained, and the photographs can be disputed in court. On March 2, 2012, I was terminated from the King County Medical Examiner's office for gross misconduct and violation of professional standards. My medical license was suspended pending review by the Washington State Medical Commission. The commission hearing was scheduled for June 2012. I spent every penny I had preparing my defense, documenting the timeline of events, gathering evidence of the systematic destruction of my career and the burial of Rebecca Winters' murder. 2 weeks before my hearing, my house was broken into. Nothing valuable was taken. Not my television, not my laptop, not my jewelry. But the safe in my bedroom was opened, and every document related to Rebecca's case was gone. The police report classified it as a burglary, case closed when no suspects were identified. Elena filed a motion for continuance based on the theft of evidence. The commission denied it. At my hearing, Dr. Morrow testified that my autopsy findings had been premature and not supported by forensic evidence. Dr. Pennington stated that I'd shown a pattern of unprofessional behavior and poor judgment. The junior staff member who'd allegedly been harassed, someone I'd barely worked with, gave tearful testimony about my inappropriate comments that I'd never made. I had no documents to refute anything, no evidence to prove the conspiracy, just my word against an institution that had decided I was expendable. The commission revoked my medical license on July 18, 2012. I was 43 years old, with 19 years of experience and a flawless record until I'd told the truth about Marcus Delacroix. I couldn't work as a pathologist. I couldn't testify as an expert witness. I couldn't even work as a physician's assistant. My career was over. Rebecca's case remains officially unsolved. The Seattle Police Department website lists it as an active investigation, but no detective has worked on it since 2012. Marcus Delacroix continues to practice law. He married again in 2014, a junior attorney at his firm. They have 2 children. The Rebecca Winters Memorial Foundation raised over $500,000 in its first 3 years, earning Marcus widespread praise as a philanthropist. He was named Seattle's Man of the Year by the Chamber of Commerce in 2015. I work now as a medical transcriptionist, typing reports for doctors who don't know my history. I make $22 an hour, enough to pay rent on a studio apartment in Renton and buy groceries. I'm 56 years old. I'll never practice medicine again. I'll never stand in a courtroom and speak for the dead. But I still have the photographs, stored digitally in 3 separate encrypted locations. I still have Rebecca's face memorized, every bruise, every defensive wound, every piece of evidence that proves she fought for her life against the man she loved. Amanda Winters, Rebecca's sister, calls me every September 19th. We don't talk about the case anymore. We just acknowledge the date, the anniversary of a murder that everyone knows happened, but no one with power wants to admit. She tells me about her daughters, Rebecca's nieces, who never got to meet their aunt. She tells me she visits Rebecca's grave at Evergreen Cemetery every week, leaving fresh flowers and talking to her sister about everything she missed. If anyone has information about Rebecca Winters' death, if anyone who worked at the medical examiner's office in 2011 knows what happened to her evidence, if anyone in the DA's office remembers the conversations about burying this case, please come forward. It's been 14 years. Marcus Delacroix has lived free while Rebecca Winters lies in the ground, and her family lives with unanswered questions. The statute of limitations for murder never expires. The truth is still the truth, even when institutions refuse to acknowledge it. I can't get Rebecca justice anymore, but maybe someone reading this can. The patient in bed 14 was supposed to have been transferred to County Medical at 11:02 p.m. on June 8, 2015. According to the nursing notes, she left Pine Valley Hospital in stable condition via ambulance, accompanied by RN Jennifer Cole and paramedic Travis Hunt. The transfer paperwork was signed, the ambulance logs were documented, and the receiving hospital confirmed admission at 11:47 p.m. Everything was perfect except for one detail. I was Jennifer Cole, and I never made that transfer. I was home that night watching Netflix with my husband because my shift had ended at 7 p.m. Someone had forged my signature, fabricated an entire medical transport, and used my credentials to cover up what really happened to Alana Koonuk. I've been an emergency department nurse for 16 years, 12 of them at Pine Valley Hospital in Fairbanks, Alaska. I've handled trauma cases from car accidents on the Parks Highway, hypothermia, victims from the wilderness, and everything from heart attacks to gunshot wounds. I've worked under pressure, made split-second decisions, and saved lives when seconds mattered. But nothing in my training prepared me for discovering that my own hospital had fabricated medical records to hide a patient's death and frame me for the cover-up. Alana was 34 years old, a teacher at North Star Elementary School who'd moved to Fairbanks from Barrow 3 years earlier. She taught third grade and was beloved by her students and their families. She coached the after-school basketball program, organized cultural heritage events, and mentored young Indigenous teachers entering the profession. Her classroom was filled with books about Native Alaskan history, maps of traditional territories, and photos of her students' achievements. She lived alone in a small apartment near the school, walked to work every morning, and called her mother in Barrow every Sunday evening without fail. She came to Pine Valley Hospital's emergency department on June 7, 2015, at 3:42 p.m. The triage notes, which I reviewed later, indicated she'd been brought in by her boyfriend, Cameron Nash. Chief complaint: abdominal pain, duration 12 hours, severity 8 out of 10. Vital signs: blood pressure 98/62, heart rate 104, temperature 99.8 degrees, respiratory rate 22. The triage nurse noted visible bruising on her upper arms and asked about domestic violence. Alana denied any abuse, said the bruises were from moving furniture at school. Cameron Nash was a 38-year-old oil rig supervisor for Arctic Petroleum Services. He'd worked in Alaska's North Slope oil fields for 8 years, rotating 2 weeks on the rigs, followed by 1 week off in Fairbanks. He had a reputation among his crew as demanding and controlling, someone who expected absolute obedience. He drove a lifted Ford F-350, carried a concealed weapon legally, and had been arrested twice for bar fights, but never convicted. He'd been dating Alana for 11 months. Her friends said she'd changed during that time, becoming quieter, canceling plans, and isolating herself from the community she'd once been deeply involved in. The attending physician that afternoon was Dr. Gregory Sutton, a 46-year-old emergency medicine specialist who'd been at Pine Valley for 7 years. He examined Alana at 4:15 p.m. and ordered blood work, urinalysis, and an abdominal ultrasound. The initial labs showed elevated white blood cell count and abnormal liver enzymes. The ultrasound revealed free fluid in the abdomen, concerning for internal bleeding. Dr. Fabrina Sutton admitted her for observation and further testing, scheduling a CT scan for the following morning. According to the nursing notes, written by RN Patricia Morrow, who was working the evening shift, Alana's condition remained stable throughout the evening of June 7th. Vital signs checked every 4 hours showed normal ranges. Pain managed with IV medication. Patient resting comfortably. Cameron Nash remained at her bedside until 9 p.m. when visiting hours ended. He was noted as attentive and concerned. But here's where the documented record diverges from what actually happened. On the morning of June 9th, when I arrived for my 7 a.m. shift, there was unusual activity around bed 14. The curtains were drawn, which wasn't standard for an empty bed. When I asked the charge nurse, Diana Fletcher, about it, she said the patient had been transferred to County Medical the previous night due to needing a higher level of care. Something felt wrong immediately. We rarely transferred stable patients at 11 p.m. unless there was a critical change in condition, and County Medical was actually a lower-level facility than Pine Valley. I pulled up the electronic medical record on my computer. The transfer note was there, time-stamped 10:52 p.m. on June 8th, signed with my employee ID number and digital signature. It stated that Alana Koonuk had developed complications requiring transfer, that she was stabilized and transported via ambulance, and that all appropriate protocols were followed. The ambulance company's digital log confirmed the transport. County Medical's admission record showed she'd arrived at 11:47 p.m. and was admitted to their intensive care unit. I immediately went to Diana Fletcher and told her I hadn't made that transfer. I'd gone home at 7 p.m. as scheduled. I showed her my badge swipe records, proving I'd exited the building at 7:14 p.m. and hadn't returned. She looked uncomfortable and said there must be some administrative error, that she'd look into it and get back to me. She asked me not to discuss it with anyone else until she'd had a chance to review the situation with management. I should have pushed harder right then. I should have called the police immediately. But I trusted the system. I trusted my colleagues. I believed that an obvious mistake would be corrected once the proper people reviewed the facts. That trust was the biggest error of my professional life. 3 days later, on June 12th, I received a call from County Medical's nursing supervisor. She said they had no record of Alana Koonuk being admitted on June 8th or any other date. Their ICU had no patient by that name. Their ambulance bay had no log of any transfer from Pine Valley Hospital that night. She was calling because she'd received a records request from an attorney and wanted to clarify the discrepancy before responding. I drove to County Medical immediately after my shift. I spoke with their medical records director, Thomas Kavanagh. He showed me their admission logs for June 8th. 4 patients admitted, none named Alana Koonuk. He checked their entire computer system. No record, no billing, no registration, nothing. Someone had created a false admission record that showed up when Pine Valley's system queried County Medical's database. But County Medical's actual internal records showed it never happened. I went back to Pine Valley and demanded to speak with the hospital administrator, Dr. Catherine Ward. She was unavailable. I asked to speak with the chief nursing officer, Margaret Sullivan. She was in meetings. I went to the medical records department and requested all documentation related to Alana Koonuk's admission and transfer. I was told I needed administrator approval for that request. I filed a formal incident report through the hospital's electronic system, detailing everything I'd discovered. The system accepted my report with a confirmation number. 2 hours later, I was called to Margaret Sullivan's office. She said that concerns had been raised about my behavior regarding a patient record. She said I was inappropriately accessing files and making unfounded allegations. She informed me I was being placed on immediate administrative leave while an investigation was conducted. Security escorted me out of the building. I wasn't allowed to go to my locker or say goodbye to colleagues. Just out the door, badge and hospital ID confiscated. I hired an attorney that same day, Robert Chen, who specialized in whistleblower cases. He immediately filed a police report with the Fairbanks Police Department on my behalf, requesting a welfare check on Alana Koonuk and an investigation into fraudulent medical records. The responding officer, Detective Luis Moreno, took my statement and said he'd follow up. Detective Moreno called me back on June 15th. He'd gone to Alana's apartment. No one answered. He'd contacted North Star Elementary School. They said Alana had called in sick on June 8th and hadn't returned to work since. They'd tried calling her multiple times with no response. He'd contacted Cameron Nash, who said Alana had broken up with him on June 7th and left town to stay with family in Barrow. He hadn't heard from her since. Detective Moreno called Alana's mother, Rose Koonuk, in Barrow. She hadn't heard from her daughter since their Sunday call on June 7th. Alana always called on Sundays. She'd never missed a call in 3 years. Rose was frantic. She'd been trying to reach Alana for over a week with no response. She'd called the Fairbanks Police Department 3 times to request a welfare check, but was told her daughter was an adult and probably just busy. On June 16th, Detective Moreno obtained a warrant to enter Alana's apartment. Inside, he found her purse, her wallet with all her credit cards and ID, her phone, and her car keys. Her car was in the parking lot. Her clothes were in the closet. Her toothbrush was in the bathroom. Every indication suggested she'd never come home from the hospital, but according to Pine Valley Hospital's records, she'd been transferred to County Medical and discharged herself from there against medical advice on June 10th. Detective Moreno returned to Pine Valley Hospital and requested all security footage from June 7th through June 9th. He was told that due to a computer malfunction, the footage from that period had been corrupted and was unrecoverable. He requested the original transfer paperwork with physical signatures. He was told all documents were electronic and no physical copies existed. He asked to interview the ambulance crew who'd transported Alana. The ambulance company, Arctic Medical Transport, said they had no record of that transport, and the crew listed in the transfer note, Travis Hunt and Daniel Craig, had both been off duty that night. Robert Chen filed a lawsuit against Pine Valley Hospital on June 22nd, demanding production of all records related to Alana Koonuk and my employment. The hospital's attorneys responded that they were fully cooperating with law enforcement and that personnel matters were confidential. They claimed I was a disgruntled employee who was fabricating allegations to justify my own violation of patient privacy laws. On June 28th, I received a certified letter from the Alaska Board of Nursing. A complaint had been filed against my nursing license, alleging that I had inappropriately accessed patient records, violated patient confidentiality, and demonstrated unprofessional conduct. The complaint was anonymous but clearly originated from Pine Valley Hospital. A hearing was scheduled for August 2015. Robert Chen subpoenaed Dr. Gregory Sutton, demanding he provide testimony about Alana's condition and treatment. Dr. Sutton resigned from Pine Valley Hospital on July 3rd and moved to Oregon. His attorney claimed he was unavailable for testimony due to health reasons. We subpoenaed RN Patricia Morrow, who documented Alana's care on June 7th and 8th. She also resigned and moved out of state, destination unknown. In August, the nursing board hearing proceeded without any witnesses from Pine Valley Hospital willing to testify. The hospital submitted written statements claiming I had a history of boundary violations and emotional instability. They produced 3 anonymous complaints from co-workers alleging I'd been aggressive and unstable in the workplace. I'd never been written up, never been counseled, never had any performance issues until I discovered the fraudulent transfer note. But anonymous complaints can't be cross-examined. They just sit there in the record, destroying credibility. The board suspended my nursing license for 1 year, pending completion of a professional conduct course and mental health evaluation. The decision was issued on August 19, 2015. Robert Chen filed an appeal immediately, but the process would take months. Meanwhile, I couldn't work. I couldn't pay my mortgage. My husband's income as a construction foreman couldn't support us alone in Fairbanks' expensive market. Detective Moreno continued investigating. He interviewed Cameron Nash 4 times. Nash's story never changed. Alana had broken up with him on June 7th, said she was going to stay with family, and he hadn't heard from her since. He seemed genuinely confused about why police were questioning him. He voluntarily provided his phone records, which showed no calls or texts to Alana after June 7th. He allowed a search of his home and truck. Nothing suspicious was found. But Detective Moreno kept digging. He pulled Nash's work records from Arctic Petroleum Services. Nash had been scheduled to return to the North Slope on June 9th for his 2-week rotation. Instead, he'd called in sick on June 9th and 10th, claiming a stomach flu. He returned to work on June 11th. Those were the only sick days he'd taken in over a year. Detective Moreno checked Nash's credit card records. On June 9th at 2:37 a.m., Nash had purchased gas at a Tesoro station on the Steese Highway, 43 miles northeast of Fairbanks. At 5:18 a.m., he'd purchased coffee at a convenience store in central Alaska, 127 miles from Fairbanks. Central is surrounded by millions of acres of wilderness, abandoned mining claims, and areas so remote that bodies are rarely found. The spring thaw was underway in June 2015, making many remote areas accessible by truck that would be impassable in winter. On September 3, 2015, Detective Moreno arrested Cameron Nash on suspicion of murder. The case was circumstantial. Alana had disappeared from a hospital where Nash was the last known visitor during hours when she supposedly remained stable but somehow required emergency transfer. The transfer was fabricated. She vanished completely, leaving all her possessions behind. Nash took unexplained sick days and drove into remote wilderness areas in the middle of the night. But there was no body, no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no confession. The district attorney, Helena Vasquez, reviewed the case and declined to prosecute. She said the evidence was insufficient without a body or proof of death. Nash was released after 48 hours. He immediately filed a lawsuit against the Fairbanks Police Department for wrongful arrest. The city settled for $75,000. Robert Chen's lawsuit against Pine Valley Hospital proceeded to discovery. We demanded production of the original medical records, the security footage, the employee badge swipe logs, and the identities of anyone who'd accessed Alana's electronic medical record. Pine Valley's attorneys fought every request. They claimed physician-patient privilege, employee privacy rights, and proprietary business concerns. The judge granted most of their motions to block discovery. In December 2015, Pine Valley Hospital filed for bankruptcy protection, claiming financial difficulties unrelated to the lawsuit. The bankruptcy proceeding effectively froze all civil litigation against them. Robert Chen explained that we could still pursue the case, but collecting any judgment would be nearly impossible. We were looking at years of litigation with little chance of recovering damages or getting answers. My husband and I lost our house to foreclosure in January 2016. We moved into a rental trailer outside of town, trying to survive on his income alone. I worked under the table as a caregiver for elderly residents, making $12 an hour with no benefits. My nursing license suspension ended in August 2016, but I was required to complete an expensive professional conduct course in Seattle that cost $3,000. I borrowed money from family to pay for it. I returned to nursing in October 2016, but no hospital in Alaska would hire me. My name was associated with the Pine Valley scandal. I eventually found work at a small rural clinic in Bethel, 450 miles from Fairbanks, making half what I'd earned before. My husband couldn't find construction work there, so we lived apart for 2 years until he found a job on the Kenai Peninsula. Alana Koonuk has never been found. She's been officially missing since June 8, 2015. Her mother, Rose, has organized search parties, hired private investigators, and appeared on national news programs begging for information. The Fairbanks Police Department keeps the case open, but admits they have no active leads. Cameron Nash continues to work for Arctic Petroleum Services. He still lives in Fairbanks. He gives interviews occasionally, always maintaining his innocence and expressing confusion about what happened to the woman he loved. Pine Valley Hospital emerged from bankruptcy in 2017 under new ownership and a new name, Aurora Regional Medical Center. Most of the administration from 2015 is gone. Dr. Catherine Ward retired and moved to Florida. Margaret Sullivan took a position in hospital administration in Texas. Dr. Gregory Sutton practices emergency medicine in Portland, Oregon, under full licensure with no disciplinary actions on his record. I still have nightmares about bed 14. I see the drawn curtains. I see my digital signature on documents I never signed. I see Alana's face from her staff photo at North Star Elementary, smiling with her students, a woman who loved teaching and died because she trusted the wrong person. I think about what happened during those unaccounted hours between when Cameron Nash left the hospital at 9 p.m. on June 7th and when the fake transfer was documented at 11 p.m. on June 8th. I think about who helped him, who falsified the records, who destroyed the evidence, and why they did it. Someone at Pine Valley Hospital knows what happened. A nurse, a doctor, a security guard, someone in medical records. Someone helped Cameron Nash make Alana disappear and created an elaborate paper trail to cover the crime. Someone used my credentials to take the fall. Someone decided that protecting the hospital from liability was more important than a missing woman and a destroyed career. If you worked at Pine Valley Hospital in June 2015, if you saw anything unusual around bed 14, if you know who accessed the medical records system that night, if you know where Cameron Nash went during those missing hours, please come forward. Rose Koonuk deserves to bury her daughter. Alana's students deserve to know what happened to the teacher they loved. I deserve to clear my name and prove that I told the truth when everyone in power wanted it buried. The truth is still out there, in someone's memory or someone's conscience. Alana Koonuk was real. Her life mattered. Her disappearance was not random. Someone knows, and that knowledge is a weight that grows heavier every year. I pray someday it becomes too heavy to carry, and the truth finally comes out. The artist's sketch from Courtroom 3 showed the defendant's hands resting casually on the defense table, fingers interlaced, relaxed, and confident. But I'd been sitting 12 feet away during that bail hearing on November 14, 2007, and I'd seen his hands shaking so violently he'd kept them hidden under the table for the entire proceeding. Someone had given the courtroom artist, Emily Vasquez, instructions to portray Victor Petrov as calm and composed when he'd actually been terrified. That's when I understood how deep the corruption ran and how many people were working to make sure Natasha Sokolov's murder never reached a jury. I'm a court reporter, officially titled as a certified stenographer for the Superior Court of Cook County, Illinois. I've worked in the criminal courts building in Chicago for 23 years, recording every word spoken in trials, hearings, depositions, and proceedings. I've documented confessions from serial killers, testimony from child victims, arguments from the city's most skilled attorneys. My transcripts have been used in appeals, cited in legal briefs, and relied upon as the official record of justice. My accuracy rate is 99.8%, verified through random audits. I've never been accused of altering a transcript or misrepresenting testimony until I became a witness to a murder trial that powerful people wanted buried. Natasha was 26 years old when she died on October 29, 2007. She'd immigrated to Chicago from Moscow in 2003 with a student visa to attend DePaul University, where she studied computer science and graduated with honors in 2006. She worked as a software engineer for a telecommunications company downtown, living in a studio apartment in Ukrainian village and sending money home to her mother and younger sister every month. She was fluent in 4 languages, played classical piano, and volunteered teaching coding classes to immigrant women at the Literacy Center on Milwaukee Avenue. Her co-workers described her as brilliant, kind, and fiercely independent. Victor Petrov was 34 years old, a commodities trader for Grayson Financial Group who'd made millions speculating on oil futures and agricultural contracts. He'd grown up in Chicago, the son of Ukrainian immigrants who owned a successful restaurant in Brighton Park. He drove a Porsche 911, owned a Gold Coast condo with Lake Michigan views, and was known in the Russian-American community as someone with connections to both legitimate business and more shadowy enterprises. He'd met Natasha at a community event in August 2006, pursued her aggressively, and they'd been dating for 14 months when she died. Friends said the relationship had been troubled from the start. Victor was possessive, jealous, and controlling. He demanded to know where Natasha was at all times, checked her phone constantly, and became enraged if she spent time with friends without him. She'd tried to break up with him twice before, in March and July of 2007. Both times he'd shown up at her apartment in the middle of the night, alternating between tearful apologies and screaming threats. Both times she'd taken him back, telling her best friend, Christina Berg, that she was afraid of what he might do if she rejected him completely. On October 27, 2007, Natasha told Christina she was ending the relationship permanently. She'd accepted a job offer from a tech company in Seattle and was planning to move in December. She hadn't told Victor yet, waiting until after a company event where his attendance was expected. On October 28th, she finally told him. According to phone records later obtained by police, They spoke for 43 minutes, starting at 8:17 p.m. Neighbors in Victor's condo building reported hearing shouting from his unit around 9:00 p.m. At 10:52 p.m., Victor's Porsche was captured on a building security camera, leaving his garage. Natasha's body was found at 6:23 a.m. on October 29th by a jogger in Grant Park, near the Buckingham Fountain. She was lying face down on the concrete walkway, wearing the same clothes she'd worn to work the previous day. Cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head and strangulation. The medical examiner, Dr. Isaac Brennan, documented 15 separate injuries: skull fracture, broken jaw, shattered cheekbone, crushed larynx, broken ribs, defensive wounds on both arms. Time of death estimated between 11:00 p.m. and 1:00 a.m. Chicago Police Department detectives arrived at Victor's condo at 9:15 a.m. on October 29th. He answered the door in pajama pants and a t-shirt, appearing to have just woken up. He said he'd been home alone all night, had gone to bed around 10:00 p.m., and hadn't heard from Natasha since their phone conversation. He seemed shocked to learn she was dead and said he'd be happy to help with the investigation in any way possible. But the detectives, James Callahan and Maria Santos, had already pulled security footage from Victor's building. They knew he'd left at 10:52 p.m. and returned at 2:18 a.m. When confronted with this information, Victor changed his story. He said he'd gone for a drive to clear his head after the difficult conversation with Natasha. He drove along Lakeshore Drive, parked near Montrose Beach, and sat in his car for a couple of hours, thinking. He didn't see anyone or do anything criminal. Forensic examination of Victor's car told a different story. Blood was found on the passenger seat and door handle, matched through DNA analysis to Natasha Sokolov. Her hair was found in the trunk. Soil samples from the car's tires matched soil from the area around Buckingham Fountain. Victor's hands showed signs of recent trauma, bruised knuckles, scratches across the back of his right hand. His clothing from that night, found in a laundry hamper, tested positive for blood spatter consistent with blunt force trauma. Victor was arrested on October 31st and charged with first-degree murder. Bail was set at $2 million at the initial appearance. His family posted it immediately through a bail bondsman, and he was released pending trial. The case was assigned to Judge Raymond Kowalski, a 30-year veteran of the criminal courts, known as Tough but Fair. The prosecutor was Assistant State's Attorney Michelle Torres, who'd successfully prosecuted multiple homicide cases. Victor's attorney was Daniel Rice, a high-powered defense lawyer whose clients included organized crime figures, corrupt politicians, and wealthy businessmen accused of violent crimes. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for November 14, 2007. I was assigned to courtroom 3 as the official stenographer. I arrived at 8:30 a.m. and set up my equipment as usual. The courtroom filled with spectators, Natasha's friends from the Literacy Center, members of the Russian-American community, reporters from the Tribune and Sun-Times, and Victor's family. Victor entered at 9 a.m. in a tailored suit, flanked by Daniel Rice and 2 private security guards. That's when I first noticed his hands shaking. Judge Kowalski entered at 9:05 a.m. and called the hearing to order. Michelle Torres presented the state's evidence, the security footage, the forensic evidence from the car, the medical examiner's report, the timeline that placed Victor at the scene during Natasha's time of death. She argued that the evidence was overwhelming and that Victor was a flight risk with extensive financial resources and no ties preventing him from fleeing to Ukraine or Russia, which had no extradition treaties with the United States. Daniel Rice countered that the evidence was circumstantial, that the blood in the car could have innocent explanations from their romantic relationship, that Victor was a respected businessman with deep roots in Chicago, and that he was confident he would be exonerated at trial. Throughout this exchange, Victor sat at the defense table with his hands hidden underneath it, his entire body tense, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles twitching in his face. But when Emily Vasquez, the courtroom sketch artist, released her drawings to the media that afternoon, Victor appeared composed and confident, hands visible and relaxed, making eye contact with the judge. The sketch was published in the Tribune the next day, with a caption describing him as appearing calm and self-assured during the proceedings. I knew it was false. I'd been watching him the entire hearing. He'd been terrified. I didn't think much of it initially. Courtroom artists take some liberties, capturing the essence rather than photographic accuracy. But 2 days later, on November 16th, I was called to the chambers of Judge Kowalski. He asked me about my transcript of the November 14th hearing. Specifically, he wanted to know if I was certain about a particular exchange during Michelle Torres's argument. According to my transcript, Torres had said, "The defendant's own actions demonstrate consciousness of guilt." He lied to police about his whereabouts, changed his story when confronted with evidence, and attempted to clean his vehicle to destroy forensic evidence. Judge Kowalski asked if I was absolutely certain those were her exact words, particularly the phrase, "attempted to clean his vehicle." I confirmed that yes, those were her precise words, recorded in real time as she spoke them. Judge Kowalski seemed troubled. He said that Daniel Rice had filed a motion claiming that Torres had misstated evidence, that no proof existed that Victor had attempted to clean his car, and that this inflammatory language had prejudiced the hearing. Rice was requesting that my transcript be amended to reflect what he claimed Torres had actually said, which was simply, and forensic evidence was collected from his vehicle. I told Judge Kowalski that I was certain of my transcription. Every word is captured by my stenography machine, stored digitally, and then transcribed into readable text. I offered to provide the raw stenographic data to prove the accuracy of my transcript. Judge Kowalski said that wouldn't be necessary, but that he wanted me to be aware that the accuracy of my transcription had been questioned. Over the next 3 weeks, Daniel Rice filed 6 additional motions challenging various aspects of my transcripts from pretrial hearings. He claimed I'd misquoted witnesses, misrepresented legal arguments, and included statements that were never made. Each time, I reviewed my stenographic records and confirmed my transcripts were accurate. Each time, Judge Kowalski accepted my verification, but something felt increasingly wrong. On December 3, 2007, I received a letter at my home address. It was handwritten, no return address, postmarked from Chicago. The message was brief. "You're making a mistake. Correct the transcripts or face consequences. This is your only warning." I immediately reported it to court security. They took a statement, filed a report, and said they'd investigate. I never heard anything further about it. The trial was scheduled to begin on January 7, 2008. In late December, Michelle Torres announced she was withdrawing from the case due to personal health reasons. She was replaced by Assistant State's Attorney Bradley Ford, a less experienced prosecutor who'd handled only 3 murder trials in his career. The trial date was pushed to February 2008 to give Ford time to prepare. In January 2008, Dr. Isaac Brennan, the medical examiner who'd performed Natasha's autopsy, revised his report. The new version stated that while the injuries were consistent with homicide, they could also potentially have resulted from an accidental fall. The original report had made no mention of an accidental fall being possible. When questioned by reporters, Dr. Brennan said his initial report had been premature and that further analysis had led him to refine his conclusions. Also in January, 2 key witnesses changed their testimony. The neighbors who'd reported hearing shouting from Victor's condo on October the 28th now said they weren't certain which unit the noise had come from. The jogger who'd found Natasha's body and had originally told police he'd seen a Porsche speeding away from Grant Park around 1 a.m. now said he couldn't be sure what type of car it was, maybe just a dark-colored sports car, possibly not even that night but a different morning. On February 4, 2008, 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin, I was called to a meeting with the Chief Judge of the Criminal Division, Honorable Patricia Hammond. Also present were representatives from the Court Administration Office and an attorney from the county's legal department. They informed me that Daniel Rees had filed a formal complaint against me, alleging that I had systematically falsified court transcripts to favor the prosecution, and that my biased and inaccurate work had violated Viktor Petrov's right to a fair trial. The complaint included affidavits from 3 court reporters claiming they'd reviewed my transcripts and found numerous errors and inconsistencies. I'd never met any of these court reporters. They didn't work in the Chicago criminal courts. One was from a suburban civil court, one was from a downstate county, and one was retired. None of them had been present in courtroom 3. None of them had access to the audio recordings that backed up my transcripts. I requested that the court conduct an independent review using the audio recordings from the courtroom proceedings. Every courtroom in the building had backup audio recording systems for precisely this purpose. Judge Hammond said that unfortunately, due to a technical malfunction, the audio recordings from Courtroom 3 for November and December 2007 were corrupted and unusable. I was welcome to submit my stenographic records for review, but without audio backup, it would be my word against the experts' affidavits. I was removed from Viktor Petrov's trial. Another court reporter, someone I'd never worked with before, was assigned. I was told the complaint against me would be investigated by the Professional Standards Committee and that I should continue my regular duties on other cases while the investigation proceeded. The trial began on February 7, 2008. I wasn't allowed in the courtroom. I read the daily coverage in the newspapers. Bradley Ford's prosecution was described as lackluster and disorganized. The forensic evidence was challenged by defense experts who provided alternative explanations for every piece of evidence. The medical examiner testified that the death could have been accidental. The witnesses who changed their stories testified for the defense. Viktor took the stand and delivered an emotional testimony about his love for Natasha and his devastation at her death. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. On February 21, 2008, they returned a verdict of not guilty. Viktor Petrov walked out of the courthouse a free man, surrounded by his attorneys and family. Natasha's mother, who'd flown in from Moscow for the trial, collapsed on the courthouse steps. Christina Berg, Natasha's best friend, gave an interview saying the system had failed and justice had been denied. The Professional Standards Committee completed their investigation in March 2008. They concluded that while no definitive evidence of intentional falsification had been found, my transcripts showed an unusual pattern of phrasing that favored the prosecution's narrative. They recommended I undergo additional training on maintaining impartiality in transcription and that my work be subjected to enhanced review for a period of 1 year. I'd been a court reporter for 23 years with a flawless record. I'd transcribed thousands of cases, testified about transcript accuracy in dozens of appeals, and never once been accused of bias or error. Now my professional reputation was destroyed based on anonymous affidavits and a convenient technical malfunction that erased the evidence proving my accuracy. I learned later, through a journalist who'd been investigating the case, that Daniel Rees had connections to several prominent figures in Chicago's Ukrainian and Russian communities who had business relationships with Viktor Petrov's family. The journalist, Marcus Huang, from the Chicago Reader, discovered that the bail bondsman who'd posted Viktor's $2 million bail was owned by a company that shared office space with one of Daniel Rees's clients. The 3 court reporters who'd signed affidavits against me had all received payments from a consulting company that was a subsidiary of Grayson Financial Group, where Viktor worked. Marcus was preparing an article exposing these connections when his editor killed the story. The official reason was insufficient evidence to support allegations of corruption. The real reason, Marcus told me, was that the paper's largest advertiser had threatened to pull all advertising if the story ran. That advertiser had financial ties to Grayson Financial Group. I continued working as a court reporter until 2012, but the enhanced review period never ended. Every transcript I produced was scrutinized for bias. I was removed from several high-profile cases without explanation. Attorneys began requesting different court reporters when they learned I was assigned to their cases. In 2012, at age 53, I took early retirement because the hostile environment had made the work unbearable. Viktor Petrov continued his career as a commodities trader. He left Grayson Financial Group in 2010 and started his own investment firm, Petrov Capital Management, which now manages over $200 million in assets. He married in 2011 and has 3 children. He gives generously to Ukrainian cultural organizations and is frequently honored at community events. His name is associated with success, philanthropy, and the American dream. Natasha Sokolov is buried in Moscow, next to her father who died when she was 12. Her mother visits the grave every week. Her younger sister, who was 17 when Natasha died, graduated from university and became a human rights attorney, dedicating her career to defending women fleeing domestic violence. Christina Berg still lives in Chicago and maintains a memorial website for Natasha, posting updates every year on the anniversary of her death, reminding people that justice was never served. I have copies of all my original transcripts stored in a safe deposit box. I have the threatening letter I received in December 2007, though the police investigation went nowhere. I have Marcus Huang's unpublished article, which he gave me before he left journalism to work in public relations. I have the truth, but truth without power is just words that no one with authority wants to hear. If anyone who worked in the Cook County court system in 2007-2008 knows what happened to the audio recordings from Courtroom 3, if anyone at Grayson Financial Group knows about the payments made to discredit my transcripts, if anyone in Daniel Rice's firm has documents showing the coordination of Viktor Petrov's defense strategy, please come forward. Natasha Sokolov's family deserves justice. The integrity of the court system depends on truth being stronger than money and connections. I'm 65 years old now, living on a modest pension. I have nothing to gain from speaking out except clearing my name and honoring a woman I never met, but whose murder I witnessed being buried under corruption and lies. Viktor Petrov killed Natasha Sokolov on October 29, 2007. The evidence proved it. I documented the proceedings accurately, and everyone involved in making that trial end in acquittal knows exactly what they did and why they did it. The truth is still the truth, even when courts refuse to acknowledge it. The infrared scan of cell block D, tier 3, cell 17, showed 2 distinct heat signatures at 3:47 a.m. on August 12, 2013. One was prisoner Na 847295, officially the only occupant of that cell. The other signature was approximately 40% smaller, consistent with a young child. I stared at the security monitor for a full minute before I understood what I was seeing, and another full minute before the horror of it sank in. A child was being held in a maximum security prison cell with a convicted killer, and every person with authority knew about it and had decided to keep it secret. I worked as a corrections officer at Redwood State Penitentiary in Northern California for 11 years before the events of August 2013 destroyed my career and shattered my faith in institutional oversight. Redwood housed 1,800 inmates, all male, serving sentences ranging from 5 years to life without parole. I'd seen violence, contraband, gang activity, and corruption during my tenure. But nothing prepared me for discovering that prison administration was actively concealing a kidnapped child within the facility, and that speaking about it would mark me as an enemy of the system I'd sworn to serve. Prisoner number 847295 was Owen Whitlock, serving 25 years to life for the murder of his girlfriend Jessica Raines in 2009. Owen was 31 years old when he was convicted. A former construction worker from Eureka who'd had a history of domestic violence arrests before the murder. He'd strangled Jessica in their apartment during an argument about her wanting to leave him, then driven her body to a remote area of Humboldt County and buried it in a shallow grave. He'd reported her missing and maintained his innocence until hikers found her body 3 weeks later. DNA evidence under her fingernails matched Owen. He was convicted after a 4-day trial and sent to Redwood in September 2010. Jessica had a daughter from a previous relationship, 5-year-old Sophia Rains. The child's biological father, Christopher Lane, had lost custody when Sophia was 2 due to drug addiction and unemployment. Jessica had full custody, and Sophia lived with her mother and Owen from 2007 until Jessica's death. After the murder, Sophia was placed in foster care through Humboldt County Child Protective Services. The caseworker assigned to her file was Linda Morrison, a 23-year veteran of CPS who'd handled hundreds of placement cases. According to official records, Sophia was placed with a foster family, the Hendersons, in September 2009, and remained there until she was adopted by them in 2011. The adoption was finalized through Humboldt County Superior Court, case sealed per standard procedure. Sophia Henderson, as she was now known, disappeared from public records after that. Schools had no enrollment for her. Medical facilities had no appointments. The address listed for the Henderson family was a P.O. box. I didn't know any of this in August 2013. I was a corrections officer doing my job, walking rounds, checking cells, maintaining order. I'd been assigned to the night shift in D Block for 3 months. It was considered the quietest block, mostly inmates serving long sentences who'd adapted to prison routine and caused minimal trouble. Owen Whitlock was in cell 17, a single occupancy cell because he'd had conflicts with previous cellmates. On the night of August 12th, I was conducting routine rounds with my partner, Jake Stevens, who'd been at Redwood for 6 years. We reached Tier 3 at 3:45 a.m. Most inmates were asleep. As we passed cell 17, I heard something unusual. A child's voice, very quiet, saying, "I'm scared." I stopped immediately and looked through the cell window. Owen was sitting on his bunk. I couldn't see anyone else, but the voice had been distinct. I asked Owen if he'd been talking. He said no, he'd been sleeping. I asked if he had a radio or television, though inmates didn't have access to electronics. He said no. Jake said I must have heard something from a different cell or imagined it. We continued rounds, but I couldn't shake what I'd heard. It was a child's voice, clear and frightened, coming from cell 17. The next night, August 13th, I was assigned to the security monitoring room. Part of my duties involved reviewing footage and monitoring the infrared surveillance system that tracked heat signatures throughout the facility. The system was designed to detect unauthorized movement, fires, or other thermal anomalies. At 3:30 a.m., I pulled up the infrared view of D Block, Tier 3. Cell 17 showed 2 heat signatures. I called over the shift supervisor, Sergeant Raymond Tucker. He looked at the screen, said the equipment must be malfunctioning, and logged it as a technical issue. He told me to document it in the maintenance report and not worry about it. But I'd operated that equipment for 3 years. It wasn't malfunctioning. There were 2 bodies in cell 17. I went to D Block during my break at 5 a.m. I approached cell 17 quietly and looked through the window with my flashlight. Owen was asleep on his bunk. On the floor, partially hidden by the small table bolted to the wall, I saw a child. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with dark brown hair, wearing what looked like a prison-issued T-shirt that was far too large for her. She was curled up on a thin mattress pad, covered with a standard-issue blanket. As I watched, frozen in shock, she opened her eyes and looked directly at me. Then she quickly closed them again, pretending to be asleep. I immediately went to Sergeant Tucker's office. I told him what I'd seen. He looked at me without expression and said, "Officer Chen, what you think you saw is a disciplinary matter that's being handled at administrative levels above our pay grade. Your job is to maintain security in your assigned areas, not to question operational decisions made by the warden and the Department of Corrections. Do you understand?" I said I didn't understand how a child could be legally held in a prison cell. He said, "Then let me be clearer. You didn't see anything. If you file a report about this, you'll be terminated for making false statements. If you discuss this with anyone, you'll face criminal charges for violating security protocols. Am I making myself clear now?" I spent the rest of my shift in a daze. I joined corrections because I believed in rehabilitation, in maintaining order, in keeping communities safe. I'd never imagined I'd be threatened for reporting that a child was being held illegally in a maximum security prison. When my shift ended at 8:01 a.m., I drove straight to the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department and asked to speak with someone about a crime I'd witnessed. The deputy who took my statement was Nicole Warren. She listened to everything I said, took detailed notes, and told me she'd pass the information to detectives immediately. She seemed genuinely concerned and thanked me for coming forward. She said someone would contact me within 24 hours. 48 hours passed with no contact. I called the sheriff's department and asked for Deputy Warren. I was told she was unavailable. I left messages. None were returned. On August 16th, I returned to work for my scheduled shift. I was immediately called to the warden's office. Warden Harold Briggs was a 58-year-old career corrections administrator who'd run Redwood for 12 years. Also present was the prison's legal counsel, Attorney Margaret Flynn. Warden Briggs informed me that I was being placed on immediate administrative leave for violation of confidentiality protocols and unauthorized disclosure of sensitive security information. He said the Department of Corrections was conducting an investigation into my conduct and that I was not to discuss anything related to my employment with anyone outside the department. I asked about the child in cell 17. Warden Briggs said, "There is no child in this facility. You're suffering from stress-related delusions, and we're recommending you undergo a psychological evaluation before any decision is made about your employment future. If you continue making these allegations, we'll have no choice but to terminate your employment and refer you for mental health intervention." I hired an attorney that afternoon, David Sato, who specialized in whistleblower cases. He immediately filed complaints with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, the State Attorney General's office, and the FBI. He included my sworn statement, the dates and times I'd witnessed the child, and the threats I'd received from Sergeant Tucker and Warden Briggs. The FBI took the case seriously. Special Agent Karen Mitchell contacted me on August 20th and scheduled an interview for August 22nd. David Sato accompanied me. I provided every detail I could remember. Agent Mitchell said the FBI would investigate thoroughly and that I should expect follow-up interviews. On August 23rd, a team of FBI agents and California Department of Justice investigators conducted an unannounced inspection of Redwood State Penitentiary. They searched D Block, Tier 3, Cell 17. According to the official report released later, they found no evidence of any child being held in the facility. Cell 17 contained one inmate, Owen Whitlock, and standard cell furnishings. No hidden compartments, no additional mattresses, no children's clothing, nothing to support my allegations. The agents interviewed Owen Whitlock. He stated that he'd never seen a child in the prison, had no knowledge of any child being held there, and suggested that I was either confused or malicious. They interviewed staff members. All denied any knowledge of a child in the facility. They reviewed security footage from August 12th through August 23rd. The footage showed no evidence of a child in cell 17 or anywhere in D Block. Agent Mitchell called me on August 26th. She said that while she appreciated my coming forward, the investigation had found no evidence to support my claims. She suggested that I might have seen shadows or objects that resembled a child in low-light conditions, or that stress from the job might have caused me to misinterpret what I saw. She said the investigation was closed. David Sato requested access to the infrared surveillance data from August 12th that had shown 2 heat signatures in cell 17. The California Department of Corrections responded that due to a system malfunction, data from that date had been corrupted and was unrecoverable. David filed a motion in federal court demanding preservation of all surveillance data. The court granted the motion, but by then the data was already gone. On September 10, 2013, I was terminated from Redwood State Penitentiary for making false allegations, violating confidentiality protocols, and demonstrating unstable behavior incompatible with corrections work. I appealed through the union. The appeal was denied. I filed for unemployment benefits. They were denied based on termination for cause. I couldn't find work in corrections anywhere in California. My name was flagged in the system. I eventually found employment as a security guard at a shopping mall, making $14 an hour with no benefits. My wife, who'd supported me through everything, filed for divorce in 2014. The stress of the situation, the financial strain, and my obsession with proving what I'd seen had destroyed our marriage. David Sato continued investigating. He hired a private investigator, Thomas Ellis, to locate Sophia Rains. Ellis spent 6 months searching. He found no adoption records, no school enrollment, no medical records after 2009. He located Christopher Lane, Sophia's biological father, who'd gotten clean and had been trying to get custody information since 2010. Christopher had been told by CPS that Sophia was in a secure placement and that contact wasn't in her best interest. He'd hired lawyers, filed motions, and been denied every attempt to see his daughter. In 2015, Christopher Lane filed a lawsuit demanding information about his daughter's whereabouts. The case was assigned to Humboldt County Superior Court Judge Patricia Langford. Christopher's attorney, Amanda Foster, presented evidence that no valid adoption had occurred, that the Henderson family didn't exist, and that Sophia had effectively vanished from all official systems after Jessica's death. The lawsuit proceeded through discovery. Linda Morrison, the CPS caseworker, testified that she'd placed Sophia with the Hendersons per standard procedures and had conducted regular home visits until the adoption was finalized. When asked for the Henderson family's address, she provided the P.O. box. When asked for phone numbers, she said they'd moved out of state after the adoption and she'd lost contact. When Amanda Foster pointed out that this violated California law requiring post-adoption monitoring, Morrison said the file had been closed and transferred to the receiving state, which she couldn't remember. Judge Langford ordered the sealed adoption file opened. It contained a single page, an adoption decree dated May 15, 2011, signed by Judge Arnold Kessler, who'd retired in 2012 and died in 2013. No home study. No background checks, no adoption agency documentation. Just a single page saying Sophia Rains was now Sophia Henderson, and the case was sealed. Amanda Foster filed a motion alleging fraud and requesting a full investigation into Sophia's disappearance. In response, the California Attorney General's office intervened in the case, arguing that the adoption was valid and sealed by court order, and that Christopher Lane had no standing to challenge it because he'd lost parental rights. The motion was denied. The lawsuit dragged on for 2 years. In 2017, Judge Langford ruled that the adoption was legally valid and that Christopher Lane's parental rights had been properly terminated. Christopher appealed to the California Court of Appeal. The appeal was denied. He appealed to the California Supreme Court. They declined to hear the case. I testified as a witness in Christopher's lawsuit, describing what I'd seen in cell 17. The Attorney General's office argued I was unreliable, that I'd been fired for making false allegations, and that I had no credible evidence to support my claims. Judge Langford noted my testimony in the record, but gave it no weight in her decision. Owen Whitlock remains incarcerated at Redwood State Penitentiary, serving his sentence. He's eligible for parole in 2035. He gives occasional interviews to true crime podcasts, maintaining his innocence in Jessica's murder and portraying himself as a victim of a wrongful conviction. He's never mentioned Sophia in any interview. Sophia Raines would be 20 years old now. I've searched social media, public records, court documents, hoping to find evidence that she's alive and safe somewhere. I've found nothing. She vanished from all official systems at age 5 after her mother was murdered, and no one with authority seems to care. David Sato, before he stopped representing me in 2016 due to my inability to pay his fees, told me he believed Sophia had been given to Owen Whitlock as some kind of twisted arrangement related to his incarceration. Maybe prison officials were allowing him access to her as a reward for cooperation or information. Maybe someone in CPS was involved in trafficking. Maybe there was a network of corruption involving judges, social workers, and corrections officials. He said he'd never seen anything like it and that, without physical evidence or witnesses willing to testify, there was no way to prove any of it. I still have nightmares about that little girl curled up on the floor of cell 17. Pretending to be asleep while I shined my flashlight through the window, I see her eyes opening, looking at me, hoping I would help her, then closing again, knowing that help wasn't coming. If anyone who worked at Redwood State Penitentiary in August 2013 saw that child, if anyone in Humboldt County CPS knows what really happened to Sophia Raines, if anyone involved in her adoption fraud has documents or information, please come forward. A child disappeared into the correction system, and no one is being held accountable. Christopher Lane still lives in Eureka, working as a carpenter, clean for 15 years. Every year on Sophia's birthday, May 3rd, he posts her last known photo on social media with a message asking anyone with information to contact him. He's never stopped looking for his daughter. Neither have I. The truth is buried somewhere in sealed files, destroyed data, and the silence of people who decided a child's life mattered less than protecting themselves. But silence has weight, and that weight gets heavier every year. Someone knows where Sophia is. Someone knows what happened in cell 17, and that someone has to live with that knowledge every single day. I pray someday it becomes too much to bear, and the truth finally comes out. The blood type documented in patient chart number 284709KL, showed O positive on the intake form dated March 3, 2016. But the same patient's chart showed AB negative on the discharge summary dated March 8, 2016. A patient's blood type doesn't change over 5 days in the hospital. Either two different people had been treated under the same patient identification number, or someone had deliberately falsified medical records to hide what happened to the original patient. When I discovered this discrepancy on March 15, 2016, I thought it was a clerical error that would be easily corrected. Instead, I uncovered a systematic pattern of patient substitution used to cover up deaths caused by medical negligence at Mercy Grace Hospital in New Orleans, Louisiana. I worked as a medical records auditor for Lighthouse Healthcare Compliance, an independent firm contracted by hospitals to ensure their documentation met legal and insurance standards. I'd been in healthcare administration for 14 years, reviewing thousands of patient charts annually, identifying errors, and working with medical staff to maintain accurate records. My job wasn't glamorous, but it was essential for patient safety, insurance reimbursement, and legal protection. I never expected that doing my job correctly would make me a target for destruction by a hospital system desperate to hide its malpractice. Patient 284709KL was officially identified as Rachel Morrison, a 39-year-old woman admitted to Mercy Grace Hospital on March 3, 2016, with complaints of severe abdominal pain, nausea, and fever. According to the intake documentation completed by RN Kevin Foster, Rachel's vital signs at admission were blood pressure 142/95, heart rate 98, temperature 101.2 degree, oxygen saturation 97%. Medical history included type 2 diabetes managed with metformin, no known drug allergies, and previous appendectomy in 2004. Blood type documented as O positive from a finger stick test performed in the emergency department. Rachel lived in Metairie, a suburb of New Orleans, working as an administrative assistant for a law firm downtown. She'd never been married, lived alone in a rented apartment, and had minimal contact with her family who lived in Texas. She'd been a patient at Mercy Grace before, treated in their emergency department twice in 2014 for diabetes-related issues and once in 2015 for a respiratory infection. She always paid her bills on time through her employer-provided insurance. By all accounts, she was a quiet, responsible person who kept to herself and maintained her health as best she could. On March 3rd, Rachel was admitted under the care of Dr. Paulo Mendez, an internist who'd been practicing at Mercy Grace for 9 years. His initial assessment notes described acute abdominal pain localized to the right lower quadrant, elevated white blood cell count at 15,000 TARs, and concern for possible appendicitis or ovarian pathology. He ordered a CT scan of the abdomen and pelvis, scheduled for the morning of March 4th, and prescribed IV antibiotics and pain management while awaiting imaging results. The CT scan was performed at 6:30 a.m. on March 4th. The radiology report, completed by Dr. Simone Chen, noted a complex mass in the right ovary, approximately 8 centimeters, with characteristics concerning for malignancy. Dr. Mendez's notes from March 4th indicated he'd consulted with Dr. Adrian Wells, a gynecologic oncologist who recommended immediate surgical consultation and biopsy. The plan was to transfer Rachel to the oncology service for further workup and possible surgery. But here's where the medical record became strange. On March 5th, a new physician's name appeared in the chart, Dr. Leonard Hartman, a general surgeon. His note stated that he'd performed an exploratory laparotomy for acute appendicitis with peritonitis on March 5th at 2 p.m. The operative report described removing an inflamed appendix and washing out the abdominal cavity. No mention of the ovarian mass noted on the CT scan 2 days earlier. No mention of Dr. Wells or oncology consultation. Just a routine appendectomy. Rachel's post-operative course, according to nursing notes, was complicated. She developed fever spikes to 103 degrees Celsius, requiring additional antibiotics. Her white blood cell count rose to 22,000 despite treatment. On March 7th, she became hypertensive with blood pressure dropping to 82/54, requiring transfer to the intensive care unit and vasopressor support. On March 8th, according to the discharge summary written by Dr. Hartman, Rachel was improved and stable, transferred back to the regular floor, and discharged home with oral antibiotics and instructions for follow-up in 1 week. The discharge summary listed her blood type as AB negative, blood work drawn March 8th before discharge. That's what caught my attention during my routine audit. I cross-referenced the discharge blood type with the admission blood type. They didn't match. I pulled the complete chart to investigate further. The more I reviewed, the more inconsistencies appeared. The patient's weight at admission was documented as 178 pounds. Post-operative weight on March 7th was documented as 142 pounds. No one loses 36 pounds in 4 days in the hospital. The admission photo in the electronic medical record showed a woman with shoulder-length blonde hair. The discharge paperwork, which required a patient's signature, showed handwriting that looked nothing like Rachel's signature on previous visit documents from 2014 and 2015. I flagged the chart for review and sent an inquiry to Dr. Hartman's office requesting clarification on the blood type discrepancy and weight documentation. 3 days later, on March 18th, I received a terse response from Dr. Hartman's administrative assistant stating that the admission blood type had been incorrectly documented and the discharge blood type was accurate. No explanation for the weight discrepancy. I escalated my concern to my supervisor at Lighthouse Healthcare Compliance, Jonathan Park. He agreed the discrepancies were significant and authorized me to conduct a deeper audit of all patient charts associated with Dr. Hartman and Dr. Mendez over the previous 6 months. What I found was disturbing. Between September 2015 and March 2016, 7 patients initially admitted under Dr. Mendez's care with serious diagnoses, cancer, organ failure, sepsis, had been transferred to Dr. Hartman's service, undergone surgery for minor conditions like appendicitis or gallbladder disease, and been discharged quickly with documentation showing resolution of their serious diagnoses. All 7 had weight discrepancies between admission and discharge. 3 had blood type changes. None had death certificates on file despite the severity of their initial conditions making survival unlikely without aggressive treatment. I attempted to contact all 7 patients by phone using the numbers in their medical charts. 4 numbers were disconnected. 2 rang but were never answered. One was answered by a woman who said she'd never heard of the patient whose name I mentioned, and that she'd had that phone number for over a year. I searched public records for the 7 patients. 2 had death certificates filed with the Louisiana Department of Health, both dated within 2 weeks of their discharge from Mercy Grace Hospital. One death certificate listed cause of death as ovarian cancer with metastatic disease. Another listed septic shock secondary to peritonitis. These were the conditions they'd been admitted with, but their hospital discharge summaries indicated they'd been treated successfully and sent home in good condition. On March 25th, I drove to the address listed for Rachel Morrison in Metairie. It was a small apartment complex. The manager, William Zhang, confirmed that Rachel had lived in Unit 214 for 3 years. He said she died in March 2016. Her sister from Texas had come to clean out the apartment and settle her affairs. He gave me the sister's name, Elizabeth Morrison. I located Elizabeth through public records and called her on March 28th. She confirmed that Rachel had died on March 8, 2016, at Mercy Grace Hospital. Elizabeth had received a call from the hospital at 11:30 p.m. on March 7th, informing her that Rachel had taken a turn for the worse and passed away despite all efforts to save her. Elizabeth had driven from Dallas overnight, arriving at Mercy Grace around 8 a.m. on March 8th. When Elizabeth arrived, she was told Rachel's body had already been taken to a funeral home per standard protocol. She was given Rachel's personal belongings and a death certificate listing cause of death as complications from ruptured ovarian cancer with septic shock. Elizabeth asked why she hadn't been informed of cancer, and a hospital administrator told her that Rachel's condition had deteriorated rapidly and unexpectedly. Elizabeth had Rachel cremated in New Orleans and took the ashes back to Texas. She hadn't thought to question the hospital's account until I called her. I told her about the discharge summary indicating Rachel had been sent home alive on March 8th. Elizabeth was stunned. She said, "Are you telling me the hospital is claiming my sister was discharged when I was told she died? Why would they lie about that?" I didn't have an answer, but I had a theory. Mercy Grace Hospital was covering up deaths resulting from misdiagnoses and medical negligence by creating false discharge paperwork and substituting other patients' information to make it appear that the deceased patients had survived and gone home. When families were too grief-stricken or too trusting to question the narrative, the hospital got away with it. No malpractice claim, no lawsuit, no scrutiny of the doctor's decisions. I compiled a detailed report documenting all 7 suspicious cases. including Rachel Morrison's, with evidence of the falsified records, weight and blood type discrepancies, and the gap between hospital discharge summaries and death certificates. I submitted it to Jonathan Park on April 1, 2016, recommending immediate notification of the Louisiana Department of Health, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and law enforcement. Jonathan called me into his office on April 4th. Also present was the CEO of Lighthouse Healthcare Compliance, Sandra Wright, and an attorney I didn't recognize, Gerald Paulson. Sandra informed me that Mercy Grace Hospital was Lighthouse's largest client, generating over $400,000 annually in auditing contracts. She said my report contained serious allegations that could irreparably harm our client relationship and expose our company to liability. Gerald Paulson explained that Mercy Grace Hospital's legal team had reviewed my findings and determined that I'd misinterpreted routine documentation practices and jumped to unwarranted conclusions based on innocent clerical errors. He said that if I pursued these allegations publicly or contacted any regulatory agencies, Mercy Grace would sue Lighthouse Healthcare Compliance for breach of contract and defamation, potentially destroying the company. Sandra gave me a choice: retract my report, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and continue working on less sensitive audits, or resign immediately without severance. I asked what would happen to the patients whose records showed evidence of fraud. Sandra said, "That's not our concern. Our job is to audit compliance with documentation standards, not to investigate conspiracy theories." I refused to retract my report. I was terminated on April 4, 2016, officially classified as voluntary resignation to avoid unemployment benefits. I contacted the Louisiana Department of Health on April 5th and filed a formal complaint detailing everything I'd discovered. The complaint was assigned case number LDH 2016-0847. The Department of Health conducted an investigation over 3 months. On July 18, 2016, they issued a report stating that they'd reviewed patient records at Mercy Grace Hospital and found some documentation inconsistencies that did not rise to the level of systemic fraud or patient harm. They noted that blood type documentation errors were not uncommon, and weight discrepancies could be attributed to equipment calibration issues. They recommended Mercy Grace implement better quality control measures, but took no disciplinary action. I filed a complaint with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They deferred to the Louisiana Department of Health's findings. I contacted the FBI's New Orleans field office. They said healthcare fraud cases required substantial evidence of financial crimes, and my information didn't meet their threshold for investigation. Elizabeth Morrison hired an attorney, Susan Blake, to file a wrongful death lawsuit against Mercy Grace Hospital on behalf of Rachel's estate. The lawsuit, filed in Orleans Parish Civil District Court in August 2016, alleged medical negligence in failing to diagnose and treat Rachel's ovarian cancer, as well as fraud in falsifying discharge records to cover up her death. Mercy Grace Hospital's attorneys filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that the hospital had provided appropriate care and that Rachel had been properly discharged. They produced the discharge summary, signed by Dr. Leonard Hartman, showing Rachel left the hospital in stable condition. They claimed that if Rachel died afterward, it was unrelated to her hospital care. Susan Blake subpoenaed Rachel's complete medical record, including all nursing notes, laboratory results, and imaging studies. In response, Mercy Grace's attorneys argued that extensive portions of the medical record were privileged peer review materials protected from discovery under Louisiana law. The judge granted their motion, severely limiting what evidence Elizabeth could access. The lawsuit proceeded to mediation in March 2017. Mercy Grace offered a $50,000 settlement with a requirement that Elizabeth sign a non-disclosure agreement prohibiting her from discussing the case or its outcome. Elizabeth rejected it. The case was scheduled for trial in September 2017. 2 weeks before trial, Susan Blake informed Elizabeth that she was withdrawing from the case due to conflicts of interest. Susan had been offered a position as in-house counsel for a hospital system that had business relationships with Mercy Grace's parent corporation. Elizabeth scrambled to find new representation but couldn't find an attorney willing to take the case on short notice. The judge granted Mercy Grace's motion for summary judgment on September 8, 2017, ruling that, without expert testimony establishing the standard of care had been breached, Elizabeth couldn't proceed to trial. The case was dismissed. Elizabeth appealed to the Louisiana Fourth Circuit Court of Appeal. The appeal was denied in June 2018. I've been unable to find work in healthcare compliance since my termination. My name is apparently blacklisted in the industry. I've applied to over 200 positions and received 3 interviews, none resulting in job offers. I work now as a data entry clerk for an insurance company, making $17 an hour. I'm 51 years old with 14 years of specialized experience that's now worthless. Dr. Leonard Hartman continues to practice surgery at Mercy Grace Hospital. Dr. Paulo Mendez left Mercy Grace in late 2016 and now practices internal medicine in Baton Rouge. Dr. Adrian Wells, the oncologist who was consulted about Rachel's ovarian mass and then vanished from her record, retired in 2017 at age 58, much earlier than expected. Rachel Morrison is buried in a cemetery in Fort Worth, Texas, next to her father. Elizabeth visits the grave on Rachel's birthday and the anniversary of her death. She told me in a phone call last year that she thinks about her sister every day and regrets not pushing harder to understand what happened in those final days at Mercy Grace Hospital. I still have copies of all the documentation I compiled in my April 2016 report. I keep it in cloud storage with multiple backups. I've posted about it anonymously on healthcare fraud forums and sent information to investigative journalists, but no one has been willing to pursue the story. A hospital system covering up medical negligence through sophisticated record falsification is apparently not newsworthy enough or too difficult to prove. If anyone who worked at Mercy Grace Hospital in early 2016 knows what happened to Rachel Morrison and the other patients in my report, if anyone in medical records or hospital administration has evidence of the patient substitution scheme, if any physician or nurse who witnessed these events has been silenced by fear or non-disclosure agreements, please come forward. 7 people died because their serious medical conditions were ignored or misdiagnosed. 7 families were told lies. 7 sets of medical records were falsified to protect a hospital and its physicians from accountability. And the only person who was punished for any of it was me, for telling the truth. Rachel deserved better. All 7 of those patients deserved better, and somewhere in Mercy Grace Hospital's record system, or in the memories of people who worked there, is evidence that would prove what really happened. The truth is there, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it into the light. The court transcript from Commonwealth v. Jackson case, CR 2009 Sufenk 576, showed that prosecution witness Carlos Nunez testified on October 14, 2009, providing crucial evidence that convicted Terrence Jackson of first-degree murder. The problem was that Carlos Nunez had died on September 2, 2009, 42 days before he supposedly took the witness stand. I discovered this impossibility on January 8, 2010, while reviewing appellate records as a paralegal for the Public Defender's Office in Richmond, Virginia, and what I uncovered was a coordinated conspiracy involving prosecutors, police, and court officials to convict an innocent man using fabricated testimony from a dead witness. I'd worked in the criminal justice system for 8 years, starting as a legal secretary and working my way up to senior paralegal specializing in appellate cases. My job was to review trial transcripts, identify legal errors, and help attorneys craft appeals for clients who'd been convicted. I'd seen mistakes before, missed objections, improper jury instructions, evidentiary errors, but I'd never seen anything like complete fabrication of a witness who was deceased during the trial. The implications were staggering. If prosecutors could create fictional testimony and judges could allow it into evidence, then the entire system was corrupted beyond any possibility of fairness. Terrence Jackson was 24 years old when he was arrested on March 6, 2009, for the murder of Deshaun Foster, a 31-year-old man shot to death in the parking lot of a convenience store in Richmond's East End on March 3, 2009. Deshaun was killed around 11:45 p.m. by multiple gunshots to the chest and abdomen. Witnesses reported hearing 6 or 7 shots, seeing a man flee in a dark-colored sedan, and finding Deshaun collapsed near his car, dying before the ambulance arrived. Deshaun worked as a mechanic at a local auto shop, was married with 2 young sons, and had no criminal record. He had stopped at the convenience store to buy milk and diapers on his way home from work. Security camera footage showed him entering the store at 11:38 p.m. and exiting at 11:43 p.m., carrying a plastic bag. 2 minutes later, he was dead in the parking lot. Police found 9mm shell casings at the scene and determined that Deshaun had been shot at close range, suggesting the shooter had approached him at his vehicle. Terrence Jackson had a criminal history, including drug possession and assault charges from when he was 19. He had served 18 months in prison and been released in 2007. By 2009, he was working at a warehouse, living with his mother, and according to family and friends, trying to stay out of trouble. He owned a 1998 Chevrolet Malibu, dark blue, matching the general description of the vehicle seen fleeing the scene. Police focused on Terrence after receiving an anonymous tip on March 5th, claiming Terrence had been involved in the shooting. Detective Frank Russo and Detective Michelle Carter interviewed Terrence at his home on March 6th. Terrence denied any involvement, said he'd been home watching television with his mother on the night of March 3rd, and agreed to let police search his car. No gun was found in the vehicle, but forensic examination later revealed gunpowder residue on the driver's seat. Terrence was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution's theory, presented by Assistant Commonwealth's Attorney James Holden, was that Terrence had targeted Deshaun over a personal dispute, ambushed him in the parking lot, and shot him multiple times before fleeing. The motive was allegedly related to Deshaun having reported suspicious activity at the auto shop where he worked, activity the prosecution claimed involved Terrence's associates in drug trafficking. Terrence's defense attorney, public defender Lauren Mitchell, argued that the evidence was circumstantial, the anonymous tip was unreliable, and Terrence's alibi, confirmed by his mother, proved he wasn't at the scene. She filed multiple pre-trial motions challenging the admissibility of evidence and requesting disclosure of the anonymous tipster's identity. All motions were denied by Judge Walter Hammond. The trial began on October 12, 2009. The prosecution presented testimony from forensic experts about the gunpowder residue found in Terrence's car, from convenience store employees who'd seen a dark-colored sedan in the parking lot, and from police detectives who'd investigated the crime. But the critical witness, the one whose testimony directly linked Terrence to the murder, was Carlos Nunez. According to the trial transcript, Carlos testified on October 14, 2009. He stated that he'd been near the convenience store on the night of March 3rd, had seen Terrence Jackson arrive in a dark blue Malibu, and had witnessed Terrence approach Deshaun Foster and fire multiple shots before fleeing. Carlos claimed he'd been too frightened to come forward immediately, but had contacted police after seeing news reports about the murder. Under cross-examination, Carlos admitted he'd had previous legal troubles, but insisted his testimony was truthful and he had no reason to lie about what he'd seen. The jury convicted Terrence Jackson on October 21, 2009, after 8 hours of deliberation. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lauren Mitchell filed notice of appeal on November 2, 2009, arguing that the evidence was insufficient and that the trial had been fundamentally unfair. The case was assigned to our office for appellate review. I received the file on December 15, 2009, and began reviewing the trial transcript and case documents. Standard procedure was to verify all witness identities, ensure transcripts were accurate, and identify any procedural errors. When I reached Carlos Nunez's testimony, I noted his address and date of birth from the witness information sheet. Something seemed familiar about the name, so I ran a routine background check through the Virginia Department of Health's Vital Records database. Carlos Nunez, date of birth matching the witness information sheet, had a death certificate filed on September 8, 2009. Cause of death, acute myocardial infarction, essentially a massive heart attack. Place of death, Richmond Memorial Hospital. Date of death, September 2, 2009, at 3:47 p.m. He had been pronounced dead 42 days before he allegedly testified in Terrence Jackson's murder trial. I thought there must be a mistake, perhaps a different Carlos Nunez with the same birth date. I pulled the death certificate. The photograph on the certificate matched the DMV photo associated with the Carlos Nunez who'd supposedly testified. Same person, definitely dead, definitely before the trial. I immediately brought this to the attention of my supervisor, senior attorney Gregory Price. He examined the documents with increasing disbelief. He said, "This is impossible. Either the death certificate is fraudulent or the trial testimony is fraudulent. Either way, this is massive." He instructed me to verify everything multiple times and document every source of information. I obtained Carlos's medical records from Richmond Memorial Hospital. They confirmed he'd been admitted on September 1st with chest pain, suffered cardiac arrest on September 2nd, and died despite resuscitation efforts. His body had been released to a funeral home, cremated on September 5th, and his ashes given to his sister, Maria Nunez Lopez. I contacted Maria and confirmed that Carlos had died in September 2009. She had no idea he'd supposedly testified in a criminal trial after his death. Gregory Price filed an emergency motion in the Virginia Court of Appeals on January 12, 2010, requesting an immediate stay of Terrence Jackson's sentence and a new trial based on newly discovered evidence. The motion included copies of Carlos Nunez's death certificate, hospital records, and affidavits from his sister and the funeral home director. We argued that the prosecution had presented fabricated testimony from a deceased witness, depriving Terrence of his constitutional right to confront witnesses against him. The Commonwealth's Attorney's Office, led by James Holden, responded with a motion to dismiss our appeal, claiming we'd misidentified the witness and that the Carlos Nunez who testified was a different person with the same name. They provided a new witness information sheet with a different address and date of birth, claiming this was the actual witness. Gregory Price immediately investigated this new Carlos Nunez. The address was a vacant lot in South Richmond. The Social Security number belonged to someone who died in 1987. The date of birth would have made the witness 15 years old at the time of trial, though the DMV photo provided by prosecutors showed a man in his 40s. Every piece of information about this other Carlos Nunez was fabricated. We filed a supplemental motion detailing the fraudulent witness information provided by prosecutors. We demanded that the Commonwealth produce the actual Carlos Nunez for deposition or admit that no such person existed. We requested an evidentiary hearing where prosecutors would be required to explain how a dead man testified in a criminal trial. On February 3, 2010, before any hearing was scheduled, something extraordinary happened. Detective Frank Russo, one of the lead investigators into Sean Foster's murder case, contacted our office requesting to speak with Gregory Price off the record. Gregory agreed to meet him, with me present as a witness. Detective Russo, who'd been with Richmond PD for 19 years, looked exhausted and conflicted. He said, "I need to tell you the truth, but I need protection because what I'm about to say will destroy careers and possibly get me killed." Gregory explained that we couldn't promise immunity, but that we'd work with him to ensure his safety if he provided credible evidence. Detective Russo explained that Carlos Nunes had been a confidential informant for Richmond PD, providing information about drug trafficking in exchange for leniency on his own criminal charges. He'd given information suggesting Terrence Jackson was involved in drug distribution, though he'd never witnessed the murder of Deshaun Foster. When Carlos died unexpectedly in September 2009, prosecutors panicked because their case against Terrence was weak without a witness placing him at the scene. Assistant Commonwealth's attorney James Holden, under pressure to secure a conviction in a high-profile murder case, decided to use Carlos's previous written statements and create testimony as if Carlos had appeared in person. Detective Russo was instructed to prepare a false witness report with fabricated details about what Carlos had supposedly seen. A court reporter, Angela Silva, who'd worked for the court system for 12 years, was paid $10,000 to insert false testimony into the trial transcript. The scheme relied on the defense not thoroughly investigating the witness. Public defenders were overworked and under-resourced. No one expected them to verify whether a prosecution witness was alive or dead. The prosecutors gambled that Terrence would be convicted, his appeal would fail on other grounds, and no one would ever discover the fabricated testimony. Detective Russo provided Gregory with documents supporting his allegations, emails between James Holden and court administration discussing transcript modifications, bank records showing a $10,000 cash deposit in Angela Silva's account 3 days after the trial ended, and notes from case meetings where the decision to fabricate Carlos's testimony was discussed. Gregory Price immediately contacted the Virginia State Police and the FBI, requesting criminal investigations into prosecutorial misconduct and fraud. He filed motions to disqualify James Holden from any further involvement in Terrence Jackson's case and to vacate the conviction based on prosecutorial fraud. He held a press conference on February 8, 2010, revealing the fabricated testimony and calling for a complete review of all cases handled by the Richmond Commonwealth's Attorney's Office. The response was swift and brutal. James Holden held his own press conference, denying all allegations and claiming Detective Russo was a disgruntled employee who'd been under investigation for misconduct. The Commonwealth's attorney, Patricia Dawson, issued a statement supporting Holden and calling our allegations desperate and baseless. Richmond PD placed Detective Russo on administrative leave pending an internal affairs investigation. Angela Silva, the court reporter, was found dead in her apartment on February 12, 2010. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by prescription drug overdose. No suicide note was found, but police reported finding empty bottles of Ambien and Xanax near her body. Her laptop and work files were missing. Her sister, Nicole Silva, told reporters that Angela had seemed frightened in the days before her death and had mentioned powerful people threatening her. The Virginia State Police conducted a superficial investigation and concluded in March 2010 that they'd found insufficient evidence of criminal wrongdoing by prosecutors or court officials. They claimed that Detective Russo's allegations were uncorroborated and that Angela Silva's death was unrelated to the Jackson case. They noted that Carlos Nunes had indeed died in September 2009, but they claimed there was confusion about witness identity and that the trial testimony had come from a different individual whose identity was protected due to safety concerns. The FBI's investigation continued for several months, but ultimately reached the same conclusion. No federal crimes could be proven. They suggested the matter was a state issue and that Virginia's legal system should address it through its internal processes. Judge Walter Hammond, who'd presided over Terrence Jackson's trial, recused himself from the appellate proceedings, citing the allegations as creating an appearance of impropriety. The case was reassigned to Judge Ellen Morrison. On June 15, 2010, Judge Morrison held an evidentiary hearing where Gregory Price presented all evidence of the fabricated testimony. The Commonwealth's Attorney's Office argued that even if Carlos Nunez hadn't actually testified, there was sufficient other evidence to uphold Terence's conviction. They claimed the alleged fabrication was harmless error because Terence was clearly guilty based on the gunpowder residue, the anonymous tip, and the circumstantial evidence. They portrayed Detective Russo as mentally unstable and pointed to Angela Silva's suicide as evidence of her emotional problems, not proof of conspiracy. Judge Morrison issued her ruling on August 3, 2010. She acknowledged that serious questions existed about whether Carlos Nunez had actually testified, but she found that the prosecution had presented sufficient evidence apart from that testimony to support the conviction. She ruled that Terence Jackson had received a fair trial and that his conviction should stand. Our motion for a new trial was denied. Gregory Price appealed to the Virginia Supreme Court. On December 17, 2010, the Virginia Supreme Court declined to hear the case, letting Judge Morrison's ruling stand. Terence Jackson's conviction was final. He remains incarcerated at Red Onion State Prison in Virginia, serving life without parole for a murder that a dead man testified he committed. Detective Frank Russo was terminated from Richmond PD in July 2010 for conduct unbecoming an officer and making false statements during an official investigation. He moved out of state and, as far as I know, works private security somewhere in North Carolina. He's never recanted his allegations, but no one with authority has taken them seriously. James Holden continues to work as a prosecutor in Richmond. He was promoted to Chief Deputy Commonwealth's Attorney in 2013 and has been praised for his high conviction rate. He's never faced any professional discipline related to the Terence Jackson case. I left the Public Defender's Office in 2011, burned out and disillusioned. I'd believed that the criminal justice system, despite its flaws, ultimately sought truth and fairness. Discovering that prosecutors could fabricate evidence, judges could ignore proof of fraud, and appellate courts could uphold convictions based on testimony from a dead witness shattered that belief. I went to law school, thinking maybe as an attorney I'd have more power to fight these injustices. I passed the bar in 2014 and practiced criminal defense for 3 years before giving up entirely. I work now in corporate compliance, reviewing contracts and advising businesses on regulatory matters. It's boring and soul-crushing, but at least no one's freedom depends on whether I can overcome systemic corruption. I'm 43 years old, and I've accepted that the legal system I once respected is fundamentally broken in ways that can't be fixed by individuals working within it. Terence Jackson writes letters occasionally to anyone who'll listen, maintaining his innocence and describing the impossible testimony from Carlos Nunez. His mother, Gloria Jackson, visits him monthly at Red Onion and continues to believe her son was framed. Deshawn Foster's widow, Keisha Foster, believes justice was served and that Terence's appeals are just the desperate actions of a guilty man trying to escape responsibility. I still have copies of Carlos Nunez's death certificate, the fabricated trial transcript, and all of Detective Russo's documentation. I've shared it with journalists, civil rights organizations, and legal reform advocates. Some express outrage. Some write articles that go nowhere. Most say there's nothing that can be done because the courts have spoken and the case is closed. If anyone who worked in the Richmond Commonwealth's Attorney's Office in 2009-2010 has evidence of the conspiracy to fabricate Carlos Nunez's testimony, if anyone in the court administration knows how Angela Silva was pressured to alter transcripts, if anyone with knowledge of this fraud has been silent out of fear or self-preservation, please come forward. Terrence Jackson has been in prison for 15 years for a crime that a dead man testified he committed. The prosecutors who framed him have been promoted. The detective who told the truth was fired. The court reporter who participated in the fraud is dead. And the system that was supposed to protect the innocent has proven itself to be a machine that processes human lives without concern for truth or justice. Carlos Nunez died on September 2nd, 2009. That's a fact, documented and verified. He didn't testify on October 14th, 2009. That's also a fact. But the Commonwealth of Virginia has decided that facts don't matter as much as maintaining the appearance of a functioning justice system. And Terrence Jackson will die in prison because no one with power cares enough to admit the system failed him catastrophically. The truth is still the truth, even when courts refuse to acknowledge it. The photograph labeled Evidence 47B, frontal torso, in the autopsy file, for case Juris ME 2014-0392 clearly showed injuries to two distinct individuals. The chest wound patterns, skin tone variations, and body proportions were visibly different between the left and right halves of the image, as if someone had digitally merged photographs of two separate bodies into a single composite image. When I discovered this obvious manipulation on April 22, 2014, while preparing exhibits for trial testimony, I realized I was holding evidence of something far more sinister than a simple documentation error, a coordinated effort to conceal the identity of a murder victim and protect the person responsible for their death. I'd worked as a forensic photographer for the King County Medical Examiner's Office in Seattle for 17 years. Documenting thousands of deaths from natural causes, accidents, suicides, and homicides. My photographs had been used as evidence in hundreds of criminal trials, and my expertise in forensic documentation had been accepted by courts throughout Washington state. I took pride in producing accurate, detailed, and unmanipulated images that served the cause of justice. I never imagined I'd discover that someone within my own office had corrupted evidence to protect a killer, and that exposing this crime would cost me my career and my reputation. Case Narration ME 2014-0392 was officially identified as the death of Maria Santos, a 42-year-old woman whose body was found in Discovery Park on March 30th, 2014. According to the initial incident report filed by Seattle Police Department officer Jason Reynolds. Maria's body was discovered at 6:47 a.m. by a park ranger who'd been doing routine morning patrols. She was lying in a wooded area approximately 50 yards from the main trail, partially covered by leaves and branches. Maria had lived in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, working as a financial analyst for a downtown investment firm. She was divorced, lived alone in a condominium, and had 2 adult children from her previous marriage who lived out of state. Co-workers described her as intelligent, detail-oriented, and somewhat reserved. She'd been reported missing on March 27th by her office manager when she failed to show up for work and didn't respond to calls or emails. The investigation was assigned to Detective Amanda Foster and Detective Isaac Brennan. They determined that Maria had last been seen alive on March 26th at approximately 7:30 p.m., leaving her office building. Security camera footage showed her getting into her car in the parking garage and driving away. Her car, a 2012 Honda Accord, was found on March 28th in the parking lot of Discovery Park, locked, with her purse inside containing her wallet, phone, and keys. The autopsy was performed on March 31st, 2014, by Deputy Medical Examiner Dr. Victor Petrov. His preliminary findings indicated cause of death was manual strangulation with evidence of blunt force trauma to the head. Time of death was estimated at approximately 24 to 48 hours before the body was discovered, placing it between March 28th and March 29th. Toxicology results were pending. Dr. Petrov noted multiple defensive wounds on the victim's hands and forearms, suggesting she'd struggled with her attacker. I was assigned to photograph the autopsy on March 31st. This was standard procedure. I documented every case that came through our office, creating a comprehensive photographic record of injuries, identifying features, and evidence collection. I arrived at the autopsy suite at 9 a.m. and set up my equipment. But when I saw the body on the table, something immediately felt wrong. The woman matched the general description of Maria Santos, approximate age, height, and build, but something about the face seemed different from the missing person photo I'd reviewed. The nose was slightly wider, the jawline more angular, the ears positioned differently. Decompositions and trauma can alter appearances, but these differences seemed structural rather than injury-related. I mentioned my concern to Dr. Petrov. He said the victim had suffered significant facial trauma and that decomposition had begun, both of which could explain appearance differences. He seemed impatient with my question and told me to proceed with photographs. I did my job, documenting everything systematically. Full body anterior and posterior views, close-ups of all injuries, detailed photographs of identifying features, including a distinctive scar on the left shoulder and a small tattoo on the right ankle. According to Maria Santos's medical records and the physical description provided by her children, she had no tattoo and no scar on her left shoulder. I noted these discrepancies in my photographic log, but assumed that perhaps the records were incomplete or family members hadn't been aware of these features. The body was positively identified through dental records on April 2, 2014. The forensic odontologist, Dr. Hannah Martinez, compared dental x-rays from Maria's dentist with x-rays of the deceased and confirmed a match. Based on this identification, Seattle PD proceeded with their investigation as a homicide of Maria Santos. The primary suspect quickly became Maria's ex-husband, Craig Whitmore. Craig was a 50-year-old real estate developer who'd been married to Maria for 15 years before their divorce in 2010. The divorce had been acrimonious, involving disputes over property division and allegations of financial misconduct. Craig had made threatening statements during the divorce proceedings, documented in court records, including one email where he'd written, "You'll regret destroying what we built together. You'll pay for what you've done." Craig had an alibi for March 26th. He'd been at a business conference in Portland from March 24th through March 27th, with hotel records and multiple witnesses confirming his presence. But detectives theorized he could have hired someone to kill Maria or driven back to Seattle on the night of March 26th, committed the murder, and returned to Portland before morning. His phone records showed a gap in activity between 11:00 p.m. on March 26th and 6:00 a.m. on March 27th. Craig was arrested on April 8, 2014, and charged with first-degree murder. His attorney, Daniel Reese, maintained Craig's innocence and argued that the prosecution's timeline was impossible, given the distance between Portland and Seattle and the conference schedule. The trial was scheduled for September 2014. As part of trial preparation, I was asked on April 21st to prepare prosecution exhibits from the autopsy photographs. This was routine work, selecting the most relevant images, ensuring proper documentation, and preparing them for courtroom presentation. I began reviewing all photographs I'd taken on March 31st. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Evidence photo 47B, which showed the frontal torso with visible strangulation marks and chest injuries, looked wrong. The left and right sides of the torso didn't match. The skin tone was slightly different. The chest width was inconsistent. The injury patterns seemed to be on two different bodies. I opened the image in professional photo analysis software and examined it at maximum magnification. The photograph had been digitally altered. Someone had taken two separate autopsy photographs and merged them, creating a composite image that appeared to show one body but actually combined features from two different individuals. The manipulation was sophisticated but not perfect. The blending left subtle artifacts visible under close examination, including slight color mismatches along the vertical center line and inconsistent lighting angles. I immediately checked my original files. The photograph I'd saved on March the 1st was not the same as the photograph now in the case file. My original showed only the actual body I'd photographed that day. The version in the official case file was the manipulated composite. Someone with access to the medical examiner's digital evidence system had replaced my original photograph with a fabricated one. I pulled every photograph from Case Sportschnab Apakemi 2014 ZO 392 and compared my original files to the official case files. 7 photographs had been replaced with manipulated versions. All 7 alterations involved subtle changes to identifying features, injury patterns, or body proportions. Someone was systematically altering the autopsy record to make the body in our morgue match the identity of Maria Santos, even though the actual body didn't fully match her description. I reported this immediately to my supervisor, Chief Forensic Investigator Laura Griffin. I showed her the manipulated images, the comparison between my originals and the altered versions, and my analysis of the digital artifacts proving tampering. Laura's reaction was not what I expected. She asked how many people I'd told about this. I said only her. She said, "Keep it that way. I need to discuss this with the chief medical examiner before we take any action." I heard nothing for 3 days. On April 25th, I was called to a meeting with Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Raymond Tucker and the office's legal counsel, Attorney Margaret Flynn. Also present was someone identified only as Mr. Garrett from the Washington State Attorney General's office. They asked me to explain my allegations regarding the autopsy photographs. I presented everything: the manipulated images, the comparison to my originals, the forensic analysis proving digital tampering, and the implications that the body identified as Maria Santos might actually be someone else. I asked who had access to alter files in our evidence system and why anyone would commit such obvious fraud. Mr. Garrett spoke. He said, "Ms. Chen, what you've discovered involves an ongoing sensitive investigation that I cannot discuss in detail. The alterations you identified were made as part of an authorized law enforcement operation. The actual identity of the deceased is classified for security reasons related to witness protection and ongoing criminal cases. I need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement and not discuss anything you found with anyone outside this room." I said, "Are you telling me we identified the wrong person? That this body isn't Maria Santos, and that Craig Whitmore is being prosecuted for murdering someone who might still be alive?" Mr. Garrett responded, "I'm telling you that disclosing classified information related to witness protection operations is a federal crime. Sign the NDA or face criminal prosecution." I refused to sign. I said I had an ethical obligation to ensure that evidence used in criminal trials was accurate and that I couldn't participate in a prosecution based on fraudulent autopsy records. Dr. Tucker said, "Then you leave me no choice but to terminate your employment for violation of evidence security protocols and refusal to comply with lawful directives." I was escorted out of the building that afternoon. My access to all medical examiner systems was revoked immediately. I contacted Craig Whitmore's attorney, Daniel Rice, and told him I had information relevant to his client's case. He met with me on April 28th, and I provided him with copies of my original autopsy photographs and the manipulated versions from the case file, along with my forensic analysis of the alterations. Daniel filed an emergency motion on April 30th, demanding that the prosecution produce all original autopsy materials and explain the discrepancies in the photographic evidence. He argued that the body supposedly identified as Maria Santos was actually someone else, that dental identification had been falsified, and that his client was being framed for a murder that either hadn't occurred or involved a different victim. The response from the prosecution was aggressive. They claimed I was a disgruntled former employee who'd been fired for stealing confidential files and fabricating evidence to interfere with a legitimate prosecution. They produced affidavits from Dr. E. Tucker and Dr. Petrov stating that all autopsy photographs were authentic. and that I'd been terminated for misconduct unrelated to the Santos case. Judge Robert Martinez held an evidentiary hearing on May 15, 2014. I testified about the manipulated photographs and provided my forensic analysis. The prosecution called digital forensics experts, who testified that they'd examined the official case file images and found no evidence of manipulation. They claimed that variations I'd identified were due to lighting conditions, camera angles, and my own errors in photography technique. Dr. Hannah Martinez, the forensic odontologist who'd identified the body through dental records, testified that her identification was certain and based on multiple matching points. When Daniel Rice asked about the possibility of falsified dental x-rays, she became defensive and said she'd never been wrong in 30 years of practice. Judge Martinez ruled on May 22 that the autopsy evidence was admissible and that I was not a credible witness due to my admitted theft of confidential files and termination for professional misconduct. The prosecution was not required to address the photo discrepancies. Craig Whitmore's trial proceeded as scheduled. But something unexpected happened in June 2014. Maria Santos, the actual Maria Santos, was found alive in Vancouver, British Columbia. She'd fled Seattle in late March after receiving death threats related to her work investigating financial fraud at her investment firm. She'd been hiding in Canada, unaware that she'd been declared dead and that her ex-husband had been charged with her murder. Maria contacted Seattle police on June 18 after seeing news coverage of Craig's upcoming trial. Detectives initially thought it was a hoax, but fingerprint and DNA verification confirmed she was genuinely Maria Santos, very much alive. The body in the medical examiner's office was someone else. The case collapsed immediately. All charges against Craig Whitmore were dropped on June 20th. The King County Prosecutor's Office issued a public statement calling it an unprecedented misidentification and promising a thorough investigation. Dr. Martinez, the forensic odontologist, claimed her identification had been based on X-rays provided by the police that were somehow switched or mislabeled. But no one addressed the central question. If the body wasn't Maria Santos, who was it? And why had someone gone to such lengths to manipulate autopsy photographs to make the unidentified body appear to match Maria's description? I filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against the medical examiner's office in July 2014, arguing I'd been fired for refusing to participate in evidence fraud. The office's attorneys claimed I'd been terminated for legitimate performance and conduct reasons. The case went to trial in March 2015. The jury found in favor of the medical examiner's office, accepting their narrative that I'd been a problematic employee rather than a whistleblower. The body, originally identified as Maria Santos, was eventually identified through DNA comparison as Natasha Rivera, a 38-year-old woman who'd been reported missing from Tacoma in March 2014. Natasha had been involved in a custody dispute with her ex-partner and had sought a protective order due to domestic violence. Her ex-partner, Detective Jason Reynolds, the same officer who'd filed the initial incident report when the body was discovered, was arrested in August 2014 and charged with Natasha's murder. Detective Reynolds had killed Natasha during a violent confrontation, panicked when he realized her body would be discovered, and decided to frame Maria Santos's ex-husband by misidentifying the body and manipulating the investigation. He'd had access to evidence systems, connections throughout law enforcement and the medical examiner's office, and the technical knowledge to alter digital files. Several other officials were implicated in helping him or looking the other way, though most faced only administrative discipline rather than criminal charges. Detective Reynolds was convicted in March 2016 and sentenced to life in prison. Dr. Victor Petrov resigned from the medical examiner's office and moved out of state. Dr. Hannah Martinez retired early and declined to discuss the case publicly. Mr. Garrett from the Attorney General's office turned out not to exist. No one by that name worked for the AG's office. and the person who attended my April meeting was never identified. I never worked in forensic photography again. My reputation was destroyed by the allegations that I'd stolen files and fabricated evidence, even though subsequent events proved I'd been telling the truth. I work now as a freelance commercial photographer, doing product shots and real estate photography. It pays the bills, but it's a far cry from the meaningful work I once did. Craig Whitmore sued King County for malicious prosecution and won a $3.2 million settlement in 2017. Maria Santos left her job and moved to California, traumatized by the entire experience. Natasha Rivera's family held a memorial service in September 2014, finally able to mourn her properly after months of uncertainty. I still have the original autopsy photographs and the manipulated versions, stored securely with multiple backups. I've shared them with journalists and reform advocates. Some have written articles. Some have expressed outrage. But the officials responsible for the fraud faced minimal consequences, and the system that allowed it to happen remains largely unchanged. If anyone who worked at the King County Medical Examiner's Office or Seattle Police Department in early 2014 knows additional details about how Detective Reynolds manipulated the investigation, if anyone was pressured to participate in the fraud and stayed silent out of fear, please come forward. Natasha Rivera deserved justice, and it should not have taken months of lies and a wrongful prosecution before the truth emerged. I discovered evidence of a crime and was punished for it. Detective Reynolds murdered someone and nearly succeeded in framing an innocent man by corrupting every institution meant to prevent such injustices. The system failed catastrophically, and the only consequence for most participants was embarrassment and early retirement. The truth did eventually come out, but only by accident, only because Maria Santos happened to see news coverage and came forward. If she hadn't, Craig Whitmore would likely be in prison right now for a murder he didn't commit. Natasha Rivera would still be unidentified, and Detective Reynolds would still be working in law enforcement. That's not justice, that's luck. And a system that depends on luck rather than integrity is a system that will fail again and again until someone with power decides that accountability matters more than protecting reputations. The Transport Manifest for Inmate, number 943827, dated June 6, 2017, documented that prisoner Alicia Monroe left Jefferson County Correctional Facility at 9:15 a.m. in transport vehicle, Narrator TRN 47, driven by officers Luis Hernandez and Thomas Erickson, with an expected arrival time at Claremont Women's Correctional Institution of 2:30 p.m. According to the receiving facility's logs, transport vehicle number TRN 47 arrived at Claremont at 2:28 p.m. with Officer Hernandez and Officer Erickson, but no inmate. When questioned, both officers stated they'd never transported anyone that day and had no knowledge of Alicia Monroe. I discovered this impossibility on June 9, 2017, when I was processing transfer paperwork as a corrections administrator, and what I uncovered was evidence that a prisoner had vanished from the custody system without explanation, and every official with knowledge of her disappearance was actively working to erase any record she'd ever existed. I'd worked in corrections administration for California's Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation for 22 years. Specializing in inmate records, transfers, and population management. I'd processed thousands of transfers between facilities, tracking inmate movements throughout the state's prison system with meticulous attention to documentation and security protocols. My job was to ensure that every prisoner could be accounted for at every moment, that paperwork matched reality, and that no one slipped through administrative cracks. The system wasn't perfect, but it had multiple redundancies specifically designed to prevent someone from disappearing. Until Alicia Monroe did exactly that, and I discovered that the redundancies only worked if people followed them honestly. Alicia was 29 years old, serving a 3-year sentence for drug possession and probation violation at Jefferson County. correctional facility in Central California. She'd been arrested in October 2015 after police found methamphetamine in her car during a traffic stop. She'd pleaded guilty, received probation, violated probation by missing mandatory drug testing appointments, and was sentenced to 3 years in custody with credit for time served. Her projected release date was August 2018. Alicia had grown up in Fresno, struggled with addiction since her teenage years, and had cycled through various treatment programs and short jail stays before the 2015 conviction. She had a 7-year-old daughter, Emma, who lived with Alicia's mother while Alicia was incarcerated. Alicia wrote letters to Emma every week, participated in the prison's substance abuse program, and by all accounts was working toward rehabilitation. Her case manager at Jefferson County, Sandra Williams, described her as motivated and low risk. On May 30, 2017, Alicia received notification that she was being transferred to Claremont Women's Correctional Institution, a facility 300 miles south that had expanded substance abuse treatment programs. The transfer was part of a system-wide initiative to match inmates with appropriate rehabilitation resources. Alicia was scheduled to transfer on June 6, 2017. I wasn't directly involved with Alicia's transfer initially. My responsibility was to audit completed transfers weekly, ensuring documentation was accurate and properly filed. On June 9th, I was reviewing the previous week's transfers when I noticed an anomaly in Alicia Monroe's file. Jefferson County's records showed she'd been transferred on June 6th. Claremont's records showed no inmate by that name had been received. This wasn't necessarily unusual. Sometimes there were data entry delays and inmates showed up in receiving facility records a day or two after departure. But 3 days was excessive. I sent an email to Claremont's intake coordinator, Margaret Davis, asking for confirmation of Alicia Monroe's arrival. Margaret responded that same day. No inmate named Alicia Monroe has been received at this facility. Please verify transfer information. I checked the transport manifest. It clearly documented that transport vehicle Narrator TRN 47 had departed Jefferson County on June 6th with 1 inmate, Alicia Monroe, Nazar line 43827. The vehicle had been logged arriving at Claremont at 2:28 p.m. that same day. I called Claremont's security office and spoke with Captain Derek Harrison. He pulled up the vehicle entry logs for June 6th. Transport vehicle TRN 47 had indeed arrived at 2:28 p.m., driven by officers Hernandez and Erickson. But the vehicle entry log noted no passengers in the transport compartment. I asked if that was an error. Captain Harrison said no. His officers had physically checked the vehicle upon arrival. Standard security protocol. The transport compartment was empty. I immediately called Jefferson County Correctional Facility and asked to speak with the transport supervisor, Lieutenant Rachel Kim. I explained the discrepancy. She pulled the departure logs and confirmed that transport vehicle Launcher TRN 47 had left Jefferson County at 9:15 a.m. on June 6th with inmate Monroe aboard. Both the driver, Officer Hernandez, and the security officer, Officer Erickson, had signed the departure manifest confirming they'd received custody of the inmate. I asked if I could speak directly with Officers Hernandez and Erickson. Lieutenant Kim said they were currently on duty at different locations, but she'd have them call me. I waited the rest of the day. No calls came. I sent follow-up emails to Lieutenant Kim. No response. On June 12th, I escalated the issue to my supervisor, Regional Administrator Patricia Hammond. I explained that an inmate had left one facility but never arrived at another, and that 3 days of inquiries had produced no explanation. Patricia seemed concerned and said she'd look into it personally. On June 13th, I was called into Patricia's office. Also present was the Regional Director of Corrections, Donald Brooks, and an attorney from the department's legal office, James Murphy. Patricia said, "We've reviewed the Alicia Monroe situation." There was a clerical error in the transfer documentation. Alicia Monroe was actually transferred to Valley State Prison on June 5th, not Claremont on June 6th. The June 6th transfer manifest was incorrectly created due to a data entry error. I said that didn't make sense. I'd reviewed the June 5th transfer manifests. Alicia Monroe wasn't on them. Patricia handed me a corrected manifest showing that Alicia had been transferred to Valley State Prison on June 5th aboard transport vehicle Shocker TRN 62. I asked why this manifest hadn't existed 3 days ago when I first started investigating. Attorney Murphy said the manifest was misfiled due to human error. It's been located and corrected. The matter is resolved. Something felt profoundly wrong. I asked if I could contact Alicia directly at Valley State Prison to confirm she'd arrived safely. Donald Brooks said, "That won't be necessary. Valley State has confirmed her arrival. Your concern has been addressed. I need you to update your records to reflect the correct transfer information and close this matter." I should have pushed harder. I should have refused to close the file until I'd personally confirmed Alicia's whereabouts. But I was intimidated by having the regional director and an attorney in the room, both telling me the issue was resolved and implying I was making problems where none existed. I updated the records as instructed and filed the matter as closed. But I couldn't let it go. On June 15th, using my administrative access, I queried Valley State Prison's inmate database for Alicia Monroe. 943827. No record found. I called Valley State's records office and asked if they'd received an inmate transfer on June 5th named Alicia Monroe. The records clerk checked and said no. They'd received 5 inmates on June 5th, none with that name or identification number. I went back to Patricia Hammond on June 16th and told her that Valley State had no record of Alicia Monroe. Patricia looked frustrated. She said, "I was told this was resolved. I'll follow up again." On June 19th, Patricia called me into her office. She said, Alicia Monroe was released early due to overcrowding and good behavior credits. She was processed out on June 4th. The transfer paperwork was created in error because the release hadn't been properly logged in the system. I pulled Alicia's sentence calculation records. She had no good behavior credits that would qualify her for early release. Her projected release date was still August 2018, 14 months away. Early release for overcrowding required specific approvals and documentation, none of which existed in Alicia's file. I told Patricia this didn't add up. Patricia said, "Look, I don't know what else to tell you. I'm being told by people above me that Alicia Monroe is no longer in custody. Whether she was transferred or released, she's not our problem anymore. Stop pursuing this. You're wasting time and resources on administrative errors that have been corrected." I contacted Alicia's case manager at Jefferson County, Sandra Williams. Sandra was confused. She said Alicia had been on her caseload through June 5th. On June 6th, Alicia's file had been removed from her active roster, marked as transferred. Sandra had assumed Alicia had gone to Claremont as scheduled. She hadn't been informed of any early release. I asked Sandra if she could check any physical records or logbooks. Sandra called me back 2 hours later. She said, "This is strange. I found the June 6th transport log in our facility's paper records. It shows Alicia Monroe, Mods 943827, departed at 9:15 a.m. with officers Hernandez and Erickson. But when I checked our digital system just now, that entry has been deleted. It's like she was never here." I knew then that something criminal was happening. An inmate had left a facility with documented custody transfer to transport officers, never arrived at the receiving facility, and was now being systematically erased from records. I contacted the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's Inspector General's office on June 21st and filed a formal complaint alleging that an inmate had disappeared from custody and that officials were covering it up. Inspector Clara Martinez was assigned to investigate. She contacted me on June 23rd and asked for all documentation I'd compiled. I provided everything: the original transfer manifest, the conflicting stories about where Alicia had gone, the absence of any valid records showing her current location, and Sandra Williams' account of records being deleted. Inspector Martinez interviewed Officers Hernandez and Erickson on June 28th. According to her report, both officers stated they had no memory of transporting any inmate on June 6th. They claimed they'd driven transport vehicle Narration TRN 47 to Claremont that day on a routine supply delivery, not an inmate transfer. They suggested the transfer manifest with their signatures was fraudulent. Inspector Martinez examined the signatures on the June 6th transport manifest. She concluded they appeared authentic, matching known signature samples from both officers. She interviewed Lieutenant Kim at Jefferson County. Kim stated that, to the best of her knowledge, Alicia Monroe had been released early on June 4th and never transported anywhere. She couldn't explain why the transport manifest existed or who had created it. On July 10, 2017, Inspector Martinez completed her investigation. Her report concluded that due to conflicting documentation and lack of clear evidence, she could not determine definitively what had happened to Alicia Monroe. She noted that if Alicia had been released, she should be locatable in the community. If she'd been transferred, she should be in another facility. Since neither appeared to be true, she recommended a law enforcement investigation into a possible missing person case. I filed a missing person report with Fresno Police Department on behalf of Alicia's mother, Dorothy Monroe. Dorothy was frantic. She'd been writing letters to Alicia at Jefferson County. The letters had been returned as undeliverable in late June with no forwarding information. Dorothy had called the prison and been told Alicia was no longer at this facility, but given no information about where she'd gone. Dorothy had been told repeatedly to contact the Department of Corrections, but got transferred endlessly without reaching anyone who would help. Fresno PD assigned the case to Detective Nicole Chen, who contacted the Department of Corrections requesting information about Alicia Monroe's last known location. She was told the information was confidential due to privacy laws and that she'd need a court order to access inmate records. Detective Chen obtained a court order on July 25th. The Department of Corrections produced a heavily redacted file stating that Alicia Monroe had been released from custody on June 4, 2017, due to overcrowding mitigation program. No release location was provided. No documentation of where Alicia had gone after release. No parole officer assignment. Just a notation that she'd left custody. Dorothy Monroe hired an attorney, Michael Foster, who filed a lawsuit in August 2017 demanding that the Department of Corrections produce all records related to Alicia's incarceration and release. The lawsuit alleged negligence, wrongful imprisonment practices, and violation of Alicia's constitutional rights. The Department of Corrections fought the lawsuit aggressively. They argued that Alicia's records were confidential, that she was an adult who'd been released and could contact her family if she chose, and that the department had no legal obligation to track former inmates after release. They claimed Dorothy had no standing to sue regarding her adult daughter's records. The case proceeded through discovery for 18 months. Michael Foster obtained partial records showing that Alicia had indeed been housed at Jefferson County until June 6th, but no records existed showing what happened after that date. There was no release paperwork, no transfer confirmation, no documentation of any kind. Alicia had simply ceased to exist in the system after June 6, 2017. In February 2019, the judge dismissed Dorothy's lawsuit on procedural grounds, ruling that she lacked standing to access her daughter's confidential records without evidence of harm. The judge noted that while the record-keeping appeared deficient, that didn't prove Alicia had come to harm, only that documentation was poor. I was terminated from my position with the Department of Corrections in September 2017. The official reason was repeated insubordination and unauthorized disclosure of confidential inmate information related to my communications with Dorothy Monroe and her attorney. I filed a wrongful termination claim through my union. It was denied. I appealed. The appeal was denied. I've been unable to find work in corrections or any field requiring security clearance. Potential employers check references and learn that I was fired for confidentiality violations. I work now as an office manager for a small non-profit, making less than half what I earned before. I'm 58 years old and will likely never have a career-level job again. Officers Luis Hernandez and Thomas Erickson both retired from the Department of Corrections in 2018 with full pensions. Lieutenant Rachel Kim was promoted to captain in 2019. Patricia Hammond and Donald Brooks remain in their positions. Inspector Clara Martinez completed her investigation and closed the case. No one faced discipline or criminal charges. Alicia Monroe has been missing since June 6, 2017. She would be 36 years old now. Her daughter Emma, who's now 14, still asks her grandmother when her mother is coming home. Dorothy files a missing person report annually, hoping that one day someone will care enough to investigate thoroughly. I've shared everything I know with journalists, civil rights attorneys, and prison reform advocates. Some have tried to investigate, but the Department of Corrections refuses to provide information, citing privacy laws and claiming that Alicia was released and is living somewhere privately, choosing not to contact her family. If anyone who worked at Jefferson County Correctional Facility in June 2017 knows what really happened to Alicia Monroe, if Officers Hernandez and Erickson remember transporting an inmate who disappeared, if anyone in Corrections Administration knows why her records were systematically destroyed, please come forward. A woman vanished from state custody. Officials lied about what happened to her. Records were altered and destroyed to hide the truth. And the only person punished was me, for refusing to accept obvious lies and continuing to ask questions. Alicia Monroe was a real person with a daughter who loved her and a mother who will never stop looking for her. She deserved to complete her sentence, rehabilitate herself, and reunite with her family. Instead, she vanished into a system that treats human beings as disposable and truth as inconvenient. Somewhere, someone knows what happened on June 6, 2017, between 9:15 a.m. when Alicia left Jefferson County and 2:28 p.m. when an empty transport vehicle arrived at Claremont. Someone knows, and that knowledge is a burden that grows heavier every year. I pray someday it becomes too heavy to carry. The forensic DNA report for evidence item marked 2019 CR 0584B showed a conclusive match to suspect profile Mabra 84792 with a probability of 99.9997%, indicating the blood found at the crime scene belonged to Marcus Delacroix beyond any reasonable doubt. The problem was that Marcus Delacroix had been in Cook County Jail on the night of the murder, 300 miles away, with video evidence proving his location every moment of the evening in question. When I discovered this impossibility on March 14, 2019, while reviewing case files as a forensic DNA analyst for the Illinois State Crime Laboratory, I realized I'd found evidence of the most sophisticated form of evidence planting I'd ever encountered. Someone was using stolen DNA samples to frame innocent people for crimes they didn't commit. And that person had access to law enforcement evidence systems at the highest levels. I'd worked as a forensic DNA analyst for 19 years, processing evidence from crime scenes throughout Illinois, testifying in hundreds of trials, and helping to convict violent criminals while exonerating the innocent through the power of genetic evidence. DNA analysis had revolutionized criminal justice, providing objective scientific proof that couldn't be disputed or manipulated by human biases. or so I believed, until I discovered that DNA evidence could be weaponized by someone with the knowledge, access, and motivation to corrupt the most reliable form of forensic evidence that existed. My discovery would cost me my career, my reputation, and nearly my freedom. But it would also reveal a conspiracy that had sent at least 4 innocent people to prison for crimes they hadn't committed. Evidence item for 2019 CR 0584B was blood recovered from the kitchen floor of an apartment in Chicago's South Loop on February 8, 2019, the location where Jennifer Kozlowski was murdered. Jennifer was 31 years old, a marketing coordinator for a tech startup who lived alone in a renovated loft building. She'd been found dead at 7:45 a.m. on February 9th by her co-worker, Stephanie Lang, who'd become concerned when Jennifer didn't show up for an important morning meeting and didn't answer calls or texts. Jennifer had been stabbed multiple times with a kitchen knife found at the scene. The medical examiner determined she died between 10 p.m. and midnight on February 8th. The apartment showed signs of forced entry. The door lock had been damaged, indicating someone had kicked it in. Jennifer's laptop and jewelry were missing, suggesting robbery as a possible motive. Blood evidence was collected from multiple locations: the kitchen floor where Jennifer's body was found, the hallway leading to the bedroom, and smears on the front door, presumably left by the killer as he fled. The investigation was led by Detective Amanda Foster of the Chicago Police Department. She processed the crime scene with forensic technicians, collected all available evidence, and began interviewing Jennifer's friends, family, and co-workers. Jennifer had no known enemies, hadn't been in any recent conflicts, and appeared to have been the random victim of a burglary that turned violent. The blood evidence was sent to the Illinois State Crime Laboratory on February 10th, arriving at my facility in Springfield on February 11th. I began DNA extraction and analysis on February 12th. Standard protocol involved testing blood samples to determine if they matched the victim or came from another individual, presumably the perpetrator who'd been injured during the struggle. The blood from the kitchen floor near Jennifer's body matched her DNA profile. As expected,